Hello there and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore something that Albert Einstein supposedly called the eighth wonder of the world. Whether he actually said those words is lost to history. There's no definitive record, no documented quote. But the idea attributed to him is beautiful. Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world, and those who understand it earn it, while those who don't pay it. Whether Einstein spoke these words or someone else did, the truth they contain is profound and worth our time tonight. We're going to take a slow, gentle journey through the story of compound interest, from ancient clay tablets in Mesopotamia to the algorithms that govern modern wealth. We'll discover how the simple idea that money can grow over time has shaped civilizations, created fortunes, trapped people in debt, and quietly worked its mathematical magic for thousands of years. By the end, I think you'll understand why this principle deserves to be called a wonder, and why it matters to your life in ways both obvious and hidden. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a mathematics lecture or a get-rich-quick seminar. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through history, through numbers that tell human stories, through the quiet magic of time and patience. We'll take our time with the concepts, the examples, the gentle unfolding of understanding. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth. And let's begin our slow drift through the centuries, through ancient marketplaces and Renaissance counting houses, through the mathematics of miracles and the reality of how wealth grows while you sleep. There's nowhere you need to be, no formulas to memorize. Just listen and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. Let's begin in the dust and heat of ancient Mesopotamia, nearly 5,000 years ago, when humans first discovered that time itself could have a price. Imagine the land between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, where civilization first took root. In the cities of Ur and Babylon, in Sumeria and Akkad, people were inventing things we still use today: writing, the wheel, the calendar, mathematics, and something else. Something that would prove just as enduring and perhaps more powerful. The idea that lending something today entitled you to receive more than you lent when it was returned tomorrow. The evidence sits in museums now. Small clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform script, baked hard by time and the fires that destroyed the buildings where they were stored. These tablets are contracts, records of transactions, receipts for loans made and repaid. And there, pressed into clay almost 5,000 years ago, is interest. A farmer borrows 10 measures of barley at planting season, promising to repay 12 measures after harvest. A merchant borrows silver to finance a trading expedition, agreeing to return the principal plus an additional amount when the ships return. This was simple interest, the most basic form. You borrowed 100, you repaid 120. The extra 20 was the cost of using someone else's resources for a period of time. It made a kind of intuitive sense. If I lend you my plough, I can't use it myself. If I lend you my seed grain, I'm trusting you to give it back even if your harvest fails. There's risk in lending, and there's opportunity cost, the other things I might have done with those resources. The interest compensates for that risk and that cost. But notice something important here. These ancient loans didn't compound. If you borrowed 100 measures of grain at 20% interest for 1 year, you owed 120 measures. If you couldn't pay after 1 year and needed another year, you didn't owe 144 measures, 20% of the new total of 120. You owed 140, another 20 measures for the second year. The interest was calculated on the original amount only, simple interest, linear growth. This distinction would turn out to matter more than anyone in ancient Mesopotamia could have imagined. The Code of Hammurabi, that famous black stone pillar inscribed around 1700 BCE, contained some of the earliest written laws about interest. Hammurabi set maximum rates, 33 1/3% for grain loans, 20% for silver. These weren't suggestions. Charging more could result in forfeiture of the entire debt. The code recognized that interest was necessary. It made lending possible, and lending made commerce possible. But it also recognized that interest could be abusive, could trap people, could destroy lives if left unchecked. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 4,000 years ago, human societies had already learned that interest was both essential and dangerous. It was a tool that could build or destroy, depending on how it was wielded. This tension, this dual nature, runs through the entire history we're exploring tonight. Let's drift forward in time, floating gently across centuries. In ancient Egypt, granaries stored surplus grain against future need. The biblical story of Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine, reflects a real economic practice. Egypt's centralized grain storage was essentially a form of national savings account. Grain deposited in good years would be withdrawn in lean years. Was there interest involved? The historical record is murky, but the principle was there. Resources saved today have value tomorrow. The ancient Greeks and Romans developed more sophisticated financial systems. Roman argentari, bankers, accepted deposits and made loans. Interest was common, though the rates and practices varied. There was already philosophical debate about whether charging interest was morally acceptable. Aristotle argued that money was sterile, that it couldn't naturally reproduce itself, and therefore charging interest was unnatural. A cow could have a calf, he reasoned, but a coin couldn't have baby coins. Lending at interest was forcing money to do something contrary to its nature. This philosophical objection would echo through centuries. The medieval Catholic Church, drawing partly on Aristotle and partly on biblical passages condemning usury, prohibited Christians from charging interest on loans. Jews and Muslims had similar prohibitions, though the details and interpretations varied. Lending at interest was seen as profiting from someone else's misfortune, as exploiting the desperate, as a sin against charity and community. Yet commerce required lending. Merchants needed capital to finance voyages. Farmers needed seed for planting. Nobles needed funds for wars and castles and weddings. How could a society function if no one could lend money and expect a profit from it? Creative solutions emerged. A Christian merchant and a Christian borrower couldn't directly arrange an interest-bearing loan, but they could form a partnership. The merchant provides capital, the borrower provides labour and expertise, and they share the profits. Technically not interest. It's a business arrangement. Or consider the bill of exchange. I give you money in London, you give me money in Rome 3 months from now. The difference in amount isn't interest, it's an exchange rate adjustment. A fee for convenience, not interest. Definitely not interest. The mental gymnastics were elaborate, but they point to something important. The prohibition of interest was based on a genuine concern about exploitation and fairness. The wealthy could lend money and demand repayment with increase, while the poor, who needed to borrow for survival, would be trapped in ever-deepening debt. This was a real problem. People did get trapped, families did lose their land. Debt bondage, working to pay off loans you could never fully repay, was common. But the prohibition also recognised something we're still grappling with today. There's a difference between lending to help someone in distress and investing in a productive enterprise. Charging interest on a loan to a starving family buying seed to plant feels different morally than participating in the profits of a merchant voyage to bring spices from the east. Both involve money changing hands across time, but the context, the power dynamics, the purpose, these matter. As we drift through these centuries, let these ideas settle gently. Interest is ancient. The tension around interest is ancient. The recognition that time has value is ancient. And the worry that this value could be extracted unfairly from the vulnerable is equally ancient. These aren't modern problems, they're human problems, and they've been with us for as long as we've been lending and borrowing, planting and harvesting, planning for tomorrow while living in today. By the late Middle Ages, the strict prohibition on interest was weakening. Merchant families like the Medici in Florence became fantastically wealthy through banking operations that technically didn't charge interest, but definitely profited from the time value of money. The Fuggers in Germany financed emperors and popes. Jewish moneylenders exempt from Christian prohibitions played essential roles in European economies, though they faced periodic persecution and expulsion. Their assets seized by the same rulers who had borrowed from them, the world was getting ready for a transformation in how it thought about interest, about time, about the mathematics of growth. But that transformation required something else first. It required better tools for calculation. It required numbers that could dance and multiply and reveal patterns that Roman numerals kept hidden. It required the mathematical awakening that would begin in Renaissance Italy. In the mind of a young man fascinated by the elegant numerals he encountered in North Africa. But we'll come to that story in a moment. For now, let that ancient world rest in your mind. Clay tablets in Mesopotamia, grain in Egyptian storehouses, Greek philosophers arguing about the nature of money, Roman bankers making deals in the Forum, medieval merchants finding clever ways around prohibition. All of them circling around this same fundamental idea that time changes value, that waiting deserves compensation, that today's coin and tomorrow's coin are not quite the same thing. Take a slow breath. Feel the weight of all those centuries, all those transactions, all those human negotiations about fairness and profit and survival. The story of interest is the story of human society trying to figure out how to manage time, risk, and trust. It's still our story. We're still figuring it out. And the wonder, the eighth wonder, the one Einstein supposedly marvelled at, hasn't even appeared yet. What we've been discussing is simple interest, the foundation. The real magic happens when interest earns interest, when growth compounds on itself, when time and mathematics conspire to create something that seems almost miraculous. That magic was about to be discovered, or more precisely, it was about to be understood, calculated and unleashed on the world. Let's move forward now into the light of the Renaissance, where new numbers and new thinking would reveal the true power of compound growth. The year was 1202, and a young Italian man named Leonardo Fibonacci, though he would be better known by a nickname, Fibonacci, meaning underscore quote, underscore zero underscore, published a book that would change everything. Its title was Liber Abaci, the Book of Calculation, and while it covered many mathematical topics, its most revolutionary contribution was simple. It introduced Europe to the Hindu-Arabic numeral system. Try to imagine for a moment doing arithmetic with Roman numerals, adding 27 and 43 to get 70. Multiplication was a nightmare. Division was an ordeal. There's a reason why calculation in the Roman and medieval periods was performed on counting boards and abacuses. The notation system itself was almost impossible to work with for complex mathematics. But the numerals Fibonacci encountered during his childhood in North Africa, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the revolutionary 0, these made calculation almost effortless by comparison. Place value meant that position mattered. The number 243 meant 2 hundreds, 4 tens, and 3 ones. Suddenly arithmetic became accessible. Multiplication tables could be memorized. Long division became possible. And with better calculation came better understanding of how numbers behaved, including how they grew when you multiplied them by themselves, repeatedly, over time. Fibonacci's book contained a famous problem that bears his name, though the sequence it describes was known in India centuries earlier. The problem goes like this. Suppose you have a pair of rabbits. Each month, every mature pair of rabbits produces a new pair. baby rabbits take 1 month to mature, how many pairs of rabbits do you have after 1 year? The answer: 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89. 144 creates a sequence where each number is the sum of the previous two. But notice something else. The sequence grows, not steadily, but increasingly. The gap between consecutive numbers gets larger. We're seeing exponential growth. Though Fibonacci wasn't thinking about compound interest specifically, but merchants were. The tools Fibonacci provided, numerals that made calculation practical, allowed merchants to understand lending in new ways. If you lend 100 ducats at 10% annual interest, and the interest is added to the principal each year rather than paid out, how much do you have after 5 years? After 10 years? After 20? With Roman numerals, this calculation would have been nearly impossible. With Hindu-Arabic numerals, it became straightforward. 100 becomes 110 after the first year. 110 becomes 121 after the second year, because you are earning 10% not just on the original 100, but on the 10 in interest from the first year. 121 becomes 133.1, and so on. This is compound interest. Interest earning interest. Growth multiplying on itself, and the numbers, once you started calculating them, were astonishing. Let's walk through a simple example together, slowly, gently. Imagine you have 100 gold coins. You lend them to someone at 10% annual compound interest. After 1 year, you're owed 110 coins, your original 100 plus 10 in interest. Now suppose the borrower doesn't pay you back. Instead, you agree to extend the loan. After the second year, they owe you not 120 coins, which is what simple interest would give you, 10 coins per year for 2 years, but 121 coins. That extra 1 coin is the interest on the first year's interest. 10% of 10 is 1. It seems trivial, 1 coin. But keep going. After 3 years, the debt is 133.1 coins. After 4 years, 146.41. After 5 years, 161.051. After 10 years, 259.374. After 20 years, 672.75. After 30 years, 1,744.94. Notice what's happening. In the first 10 years, the debt increased by 159 coins. In the second 10 years, it increased by another 413 coins. In the third 10 years, by another 1,072 coins. Same interest rate, same annual percentage, but the absolute growth is accelerating. This is the nature of exponential growth, and it's deeply counterintuitive to human brains that evolved to think linearly. Italian merchants and bankers in the 13th and 14th centuries started keeping detailed records of compound growth. They developed tables showing how money would grow at various interest rates over various time periods. These tables were valuable trade secrets. Understanding compound interest gave you an edge in negotiations, in planning, in building wealth. The Medici family rose to become one of the most powerful banking dynasties in Europe, partly because they understood compound growth better than their competitors. They could calculate the true value of long-term loans. They could assess risk accurately. They could structure debt in ways that seemed generous, but would compound in their favour over time. As the Renaissance progressed, mathematicians began to study compound interest more formally. They discovered rules and patterns. One of the most useful is the rule of 72, though its origins are murky. The rule states that to estimate how long it takes for money to double at a given interest rate, you divide 72 by the interest rate. At 6% interest, money doubles in approximately 12 years. At 8%, approximately 9 years. At 12%, approximately 6 years. This rule works because of the mathematical properties of logarithms, which weren't fully understood when the rule first appeared. But the rule itself was accurate enough for practical purposes. Merchants could quickly estimate doubling times in their heads. 72 divided by the interest rate. simple, useful, powerful. But the deeper mathematics of compound interest required more advanced tools. In the late 17th century, a Swiss mathematician named Jacob Bernoulli was investigating a question about compound interest. What happens if you compound not annually, but more frequently? What if interest is calculated and added every 6 months, every month, every day, every hour, every second? Intuitively, you might think that as you compound more and more frequently, the growth would accelerate without limit. But Bernoulli discovered something remarkable. As the compounding frequency increases, the total amount approaches a limit. It converges on a specific number. That number is approximately 2.71828, and it's represented by the letter E. It's now called Euler's number, though Bernoulli was the first to discover it in this context. It's one of the fundamental constants of mathematics, appearing in calculus, probability theory, physics, and countless other fields. And it emerged from studying compound interest. What Bernoulli had discovered was continuous compounding, the theoretical limit of compound growth when interest is added infinitely often. If you invest 100 coins at 100% annual interest compounded continuously for 1 year, you end up with approximately 271.828 coins, not 300, which is what you might expect if you think of doubling, not 200, which is simple interest at 100%. But this specific number, times your starting amount where interest is flowing constantly, every infinitesimal moment adding to the total. This might seem abstract, and you're welcome to let it drift past you without grasping every detail. The important point is this. Mathematicians were discovering that compound interest had deep, beautiful mathematical properties. It wasn't just a practical tool for merchants. It was a window into how growth works, how exponential functions behave, how the mathematics of continuous change operates. Let's pause here for a moment and let these ideas settle. Renaissance Italy. New numerals making calculation possible. Merchants discovering that interest on interest creates accelerating growth. Mathematicians finding fundamental constants hidden in the arithmetic of compound loans. All of this was preparing the ground for the modern financial world, though no one at the time could have imagined credit cards and retirement accounts and national debts measured in the trillions. Take a slow breath. Feel yourself sinking a little deeper into comfort. We've travelled from ancient Mesopotamia to Renaissance Europe, from clay tablets to mathematical constants. The journey continues, but there's no rush. Let your mind drift with these ideas, these numbers that grow while you rest. Compound interest is patient. It works while you sleep. Perhaps that's part of its wonder. It doesn't require constant attention or effort. It just requires time. The human brain, as I mentioned earlier, struggles with exponential growth. We're wired to think linearly. If I walk 10 miles in 2 hours, I'll walk 20 miles in 4 hours, 30 miles in 6 hours. Straight line, predictable. But compound growth doesn't work that way. The first 10 years of growth might add 100 coins to your 1,000, but the second 10 years might add 300, and the third 10 years might add 900. Same percentage, but the absolute numbers are accelerating. There's a famous parable that illustrates this, ancient in origin, though retold in many cultures. A clever person, sometimes a vizier, sometimes a mathematician, sometimes a servant, does a service for a king. The king offers a reward. The clever person asks for grains of rice to be placed on a chessboard, 1 grain on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, doubling each time for all 64 squares. The king agrees, thinking this is a modest request, but let's calculate. The first square has 1 grain, the second has 2, the third has 4. By the 10th square, we're at 512 grains, still manageable. By the 20th square, we're at 524,288 grains, getting substantial. By the 30th square, we're over 1 billion grains. By the 40th square, we're over 1 trillion grains. and by the 64th square, the final square, the total number of grains would be 18 quintillion, 446 quadrillion, 744 trillion, 73 billion, 709 million, 551,615. That's more rice than has been produced in all of human history. The king cannot possibly fulfill the promise. The kingdom is bankrupted by exponential growth. This is a parable, not history, but it captures something true about compound growth. It starts slow and becomes overwhelming. The first few doublings seem trivial, but keep doubling, keep compounding, and eventually the numbers exceed imagination. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers were beginning to grasp this. They could calculate it. They could see it in their tables. But emotionally, intuitively, it remained difficult to believe. It still is. Even today, people intellectually understand compound interest but don't feel its power until they watch it work, or work against them, over years and decades. The mathematical awakening we've been exploring wasn't just about numbers and calculations. It was about developing tools to understand time, growth, and change. The Hindu-Arabic numerals that Fibonacci introduced, the compound interest tables that merchants created, the rules of thumb like the rule of 72, Bernoulli's discovery of E and continuous compounding. These were all ways of grasping something that resists easy grasp, exponential growth over time. And here's something worth sitting with quietly. The mathematics of compound interest is the same whether you're lending or borrowing, earning or owing. The same exponential curve that can build wealth can also deepen debt. The same time that works magic in your favour in a savings account works against you in credit card debt. It's neutral mathematics, but the human consequences are anything but neutral. By the end of the Renaissance period, the foundations were in place. The mathematical tools existed. The understanding, at least among educated merchants and mathematicians, was solid. Interest was no longer prohibited in most of Europe. The Reformation and the rise of capitalism had shifted moral and religious attitudes. Lending at interest was accepted as legitimate business. Compound interest was understood and calculable. What remained was for this understanding to spread, to become democratized, to touch the lives of ordinary people rather than just bankers and nobles. That would take more time, centuries. In fact, but the seeds were planted. The mathematical wonder was revealed, waiting for the right conditions to flourish and transform how human societies managed wealth, risk, and time itself. Let your breath slow. Let these historical currents wash over you like gentle waves. We've moved from ancient prohibitions to Renaissance calculations, from moral philosophy to pure mathematics, from clay tablets to E and logarithms. The story continues, but you don't need to hold on to every detail. Let it flow. Let it settle where it will. The compound interest of this knowledge will work on your understanding over time, even as you drift towards sleep. Rest easy in this. For thousands of years, humans have been learning how time can transform small amounts into large ones, how patience can multiply resources, how the future grows from the present in ways that surprise and astound us. This learning continues. The eighth wonder, whether Einstein named it or not, remains wonderful, remains powerful, remains worthy of our attention and our awe. And now, as we prepare to move forward into stories of compound interest at work in real lives and real fortunes, let yourself rest here for a moment in this mathematical space we've created. Numbers and time, growth and patience. The slow magic of multiplication. Let it all settle gently, like snow falling on a quiet evening, each flake adding to the total, compound upon compound, until the world is transformed into something beautiful and new. Let's move forward now from mathematical theory into mathematical practice, from understanding compound growth in the abstract to seeing what it actually does when unleashed on real money over real time. Because the numbers we've been discussing, The doubling times, the exponential curves, the constant E, these weren't just academic curiosities. They were tools that would create some of the most astonishing accumulations of wealth in human history, and some of the most instructive stories about patience, time, and the power of letting money grow undisturbed. We'll begin with a story that's become almost mythical in discussions of compound interest, a story so often told that the details have become worn smooth like a river stone. It's the story of Manhattan Island and $24. In 1626, according to traditional accounts, Dutch colonist Peter Minuit purchased Manhattan Island from the Lenape people for trade goods valued at 60 guilders, roughly $24 in the currency of the time. This transaction, ethically problematic in countless ways we should acknowledge, has been used for generations to teach a lesson about compound interest that's quite different from the usual moral of the story. The usual telling treats this as the greatest real estate bargain in history. Manhattan, now worth hundreds of billions of dollars, purchased for essentially nothing. The Lenape were foolish, the Dutch were clever, or so the story implies, but let's consider it differently. Let's ask a question about compound interest. If the Lenape had taken that $24 and invested it at a reasonable rate of return, say 8% annually, and if that money had been allowed to compound undisturbed for nearly 400 years, what would it be worth today? Take a moment and guess. $24 at 8% compound interest for roughly 400 years. What's your intuition? A few million? Tens of millions? The actual number, calculated precisely, is beyond comprehension. At 8% compound interest for 400 years, $24 becomes several $1 trillion, far more than the current value of all the real estate in Manhattan. The Lenape, according to this calculation, could have kept their island and bought back all of Manhattan many times over with the compounded investment. Now, this thought experiment is absurd on multiple levels. There was no investment vehicle in 1626 that would have provided safe 8% returns for 4 centuries. There's no institution that would have protected those returns through wars, depressions, currency changes, and political upheavals. The entire premise is impossible, but it illustrates something profound about the power of compound interest over very long time periods. Time, given enough of it, overwhelms almost every other variable. Let's consider a more realistic historical example, one with actual documentation and real outcomes. The story of Benjamin Franklin's gift to Boston and Philadelphia. Benjamin Franklin died in 1790. He was 84 years old, famous as a scientist, diplomat, writer, and founding father. He had accumulated modest wealth through his printing business and various investments, and in his will, he left £1,000 sterling each to the cities of Boston and Philadelphia. But there was a condition. The money was to be lent out at interest to young tradesmen to help them establish their businesses. The interest would compound. After 100 years, 3/4 of the fund could be spent on public works, but 1/4 would continue compounding for another 100 years. After 200 years total, the remainder could be spent. Franklin calculated that after 100 years, at 5% compound interest, the £1,000 would grow to approximately £131,000. After 200 years, approximately £4 million. He was essentially creating a test case for compound interest to benefit future generations of his fellow citizens. What actually happened is instructive. The Boston Fund grew, but not as Franklin had projected. By 1890, after 100 years, it was worth approximately $90,000, substantial, but less than Franklin's calculation suggested. Why? Because not all the loans were repaid. Some borrowers defaulted. Some interest went uncollected. The real world isn't as tidy as compound interest tables. Still, the fund was used to establish a trade school, the Franklin Institute, and the remaining quarter continued compounding. By 1990, after the full 200 years, The Boston fund was worth approximately $5 million. Philadelphia's fund had a similar trajectory, eventually worth over $2 million. These numbers are far less than Franklin's calculations predicted, but they're still remarkable. £1,000, left to compound for 200 years with regular withdrawals, still produced millions of dollars for public benefit. The principle worked, even if the practice was messier than the theory. What Franklin's gift demonstrates is both the power and the limitations of compound interest in the real world. Yes, money compounds over time if left undisturbed, but money is rarely left completely undisturbed. There are defaults, withdrawals, expenses, inefficiencies. The theoretical curve and the actual outcome diverge, but even the actual outcome can be substantial. Let's shift now to a story that's more recent and more directly relevant to how ordinary people might think about compound interest. The story of Anne Scheiber. Anne Scheiber was born in 1903 and lived until 1995, dying at the age of 101. She worked for the Internal Revenue Service as an auditor for 23 years, retiring in 1944 at the age of 51 with a pension of approximately $3,150 per year. She never married. She lived frugally in a small rent-controlled apartment in Manhattan. She wore the same black coat for years. She read financial newspapers at the public library rather than subscribing. When she retired, she'd saved $5,000 from her salary. This was her investment capital. $5,000 in 1944. She invested this money in stocks, blue-chip dividend-paying companies mostly. She rarely sold. She reinvested all dividends. She paid attention to her investments, reading those financial newspapers daily, but she didn't trade frequently. She just bought quality companies and held them, letting the dividends compound, occasionally adding small amounts from her modest pension. When Anne Scheiber died in 1995, her investment portfolio was worth $22 million. From $5,000 to $22 million. 51 years of compound growth. Let's pause and let that sink in. $22 million. From a woman who never earned a high salary, who lived in modest circumstances, who attracted no attention during her life. She had no special knowledge. She wasn't a financial genius. She simply understood compound interest and had extraordinary patience. Her annual return averaged approximately 18% over those 5 decades, higher than the stock market average, but achievable through careful stock selection and full dividend reinvestment. But the real secret was time. 51 years of uninterrupted compounding. 51 years of not panicking during market downturns. 51 years of living frugally so she never had to withdraw from her portfolio. When she died, she left the entire $22 million to Yeshiva University for scholarships for women. The university had no idea she existed until they were contacted by her lawyer. She had been completely anonymous. Her wealth was invisible because she chose not to spend it. Anne Scheiber's story has become legendary in investment circles because it demonstrates something counterintuitive. You don't need to start with a lot of money to accumulate a fortune through compound interest. You need time, discipline, and patience. And perhaps most importantly, you need to avoid interrupting the compounding. Every time you withdraw from an investment, you're not just taking out that amount, you're taking out all the future compound growth that amount would have generated. If Anne Scheiber had withdrawn $100,000 at some point to buy a nicer apartment, she wouldn't have had $100,000 less at the end. She would have had perhaps $1 million less, because that $100,000 would have compounded over the remaining years. Let's consider another example, this one even more extreme. Grace Groner lived from 1909 to 2010, dying at the age of 100. She worked as a secretary for Abbott Laboratories for 43 years. In 1935, when she was 26 years old, she bought 3 shares of Abbott stock for $60 per share, a total investment of $180. She never sold those shares. She reinvested all dividends. Over 75 years, through stock splits and dividend reinvestment, those 3 shares multiplied. When Grace Groner died, her Abbott holding was worth approximately $7 million. $180 became $7 million. The annual return works out to approximately 15%, which is excellent but not impossible. The magic was entirely in the time, 75 years, 3/4 of a century. Multiple market crashes, multiple recessions, wars, technological revolutions, and through it all those shares just sat there, compounding, splitting, growing, accumulating. Grace Groner, like Ann Scheiber, lived modestly. She drove an old car for decades. She lived in a small cottage. She mended and reused clothing. When she died, she left her $7 million to her alma mater, Lake Forest College, to fund scholarships. These stories, Franklin's Gift, Ann Scheiber, Grace Groner, have a certain fairy tale quality. They're inspiring. They suggest that anyone can accumulate wealth through compound interest and patience. And there's truth in that. But we should be careful not to oversimplify or draw the wrong lessons. First, these are extraordinary examples. For every Ann Scheiber who turned $5,000 into $22 million, there were thousands of people who invested and earned more modest returns, or who needed to withdraw money for emergencies, or who made poor investment choices. We're looking at outliers, success stories selected precisely because they're remarkable. Second, these stories required not just time, but freedom from the need to spend. Ann Scheiber could let her money compound for 51 years because her pension covered her minimal living expenses. Most people need to withdraw from savings at some point, for medical bills, for children's education, for home repairs, for retirement living expenses. The ability to leave money completely untouched for decades is itself a form of privilege. Third, the investment returns these women achieved were good but not miraculous. 15 to 18% annual returns are achievable through stock market investing, especially over very long periods and especially with dividend reinvestment. But they require weathering significant volatility. Ann Scheiber's portfolio surely lost half its value at various points during market crashes. The discipline to not panic and sell during those crashes is psychologically difficult. Most people can't do it. And fourth, timing mattered. These women were investing during the great American economic expansion of the 20th century. The stock market had an upward trajectory over their lifetimes that isn't guaranteed for future generations. Past performance, as every investment disclaimer notes, doesn't guarantee future results. But even with all these caveats, these stories illustrate something real about compound interest. Small amounts, given enough time, can become large amounts. The key variables are rate of return, time, and consistency. And of those 3, time might be the most powerful. Let's play with some numbers together gently, without pressure to remember them all. Suppose you invest $100 per month starting at age 25. You invest in a broad stock index that averages 7% annual return after inflation. You continue this for 40 years until age 65. Your total contributions over those 40 years are $48,000. $100 times 12 months times 40 years. Not a trivial amount, but achievable for many people over a working lifetime. At 7% compound annual return, this becomes approximately $262,000 by age 65. Your $48,000 in contributions has grown to $262,000. The difference, $214,000, is entirely from compound returns. You contributed less than 20% of the final total. Compound interest contributed more than 80%. Now suppose you wait until age 35 to start, giving yourself only 30 years instead of 40. Same $100 per month, same 7% return. Your contributions are $36,000, less than before, because you're contributing for fewer years. Your final total is approximately $122,000. By starting 10 years earlier, you contributed only $12,000 more, but you ended up with $140,000 more. That extra 10 years of compounding is worth far more than the extra contributions. This is why financial advisors constantly emphasize starting early. Those extra years at the beginning, when your balance is small, don't seem important. But they're compounding through all the subsequent years, and that compounding compounds on itself. There's a famous thought experiment, sometimes called, quote, one investor, starts contributing $200 per month to a retirement account at age 25. After 10 years, at age 35, they stop contributing entirely, but leave the money invested. Investor B waits until age 35 to start, but then contributes $200 per month for 30 years, until age 65. At age 65, assuming 7% annual returns, Investor A has more money despite contributing for only 10 years versus Investor B's 30 years. The total contributions tell the story. Investor A contributed $24,000. Investor B contributed $72,000, 3 times as much. But Investor A's money had 30 extra years to compound, and those 30 years of compounding on the initial contributions outweighed Investor B's larger total contributions. This thought experiment is somewhat artificial. It assumes Investor A has the discipline to never contribute again, which is unlikely. But it illustrates the disproportionate importance of early compounding. The first dollars you invest are the most valuable because they have the most time to grow. Let's return to that parable we mentioned earlier, the rice and the chessboard. The story is sometimes attributed to ancient India, sometimes to Persia, sometimes presented as purely mathematical fiction. But the mathematics is real and instructive. A chessboard has 64 squares. Start with 1 grain of rice on the first square, put 2 grains on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth. Each square has double the previous square. By the time you reach the 64th square, you're placing over 9 quintillion grains on that final square alone. But here's what's really interesting. More than half the total rice is on the final square. The last square contains more rice than all the previous 63 squares combined. This is the nature of exponential growth. The end dominates. The final doubling is larger than everything that came before. This applies to compound interest too. Suppose you save diligently for 40 years and your money compounds at 7% annually. In the first 20 years, your money grows substantially. But in the second 20 years, it grows even more in absolute terms, even though the percentage rate is the same. The final decade of saving might add more to your total than the first 3 decades combined, because you're earning returns on a much larger base. This creates a psychological challenge. When you're young and starting to save, the results feel discouraging. You contribute for years and the balance grows slowly. You might think, at this rate, I'll never have enough to retire. But if you persist, the growth accelerates. The final decade before retirement often sees the most dramatic absolute growth because the compounding has had time to build on itself. Warren Buffett, whom we'll discuss more later, describes compound interest as _3_. It starts small, but as it rolls, it accumulates more snow. The bigger it gets, the more surface area it has, the more snow it picks up per rotation. Eventually it becomes massive, almost unstoppable, but it has to roll for a long time. Buffett himself didn't become a billionaire until his 50s, despite investing successfully since his teens. The vast majority of his wealth was created after age 65, not because he suddenly got better at investing, but because the compounding finally reached the steep part of the exponential curve. Let's talk for a moment about the Rule of 72, which we mentioned briefly before. This rule provides a quick way to estimate doubling time. You divide 72 by your annual rate of return, and the result is approximately how many years it takes for your money to double. At 6% annual return, your money doubles in approximately 12 years. 72 divided by 6 equals 12. At 8%, it doubles in approximately 9 years. At 10%, approximately 7.2 years. At 3%, approximately 24 years. This rule helps build intuition about compound growth. If you're earning 6% annually, your money will double roughly every 12 years. So if you invest $10,000 at age 30, you'll have approximately $20,000 at age 42, $40,000 at age 54, and $80,000 at age 66. 3 doublings over 36 years turns $10,000 into $80,000. But notice what happens if you can earn a higher return. At 9% instead of 6%, your money doubles every 8 years instead of every 12. Over 36 years, that's 4.5 doublings instead of 3. 10,000 becomes approximately 113,000 instead of 80,000. Same time period, but a 3 percentage point higher return produces 40% more final wealth. This is why investment fees matter so much. If you're earning 8% gross returns but paying 1% in fees, your net return is 7%. Over 40 years, this seemingly small difference can reduce your final wealth by 25% or more. The fees compound against you just as the returns compound for you. Let's sit quietly with these numbers for a moment. Let them settle. You don't need to remember the specific calculations. The pattern is what matters. Small differences in rate of return, compounded over long periods, create large differences in outcomes. Time amplifies everything, both the returns and the costs. There's something almost mystical about compound interest when you really contemplate it. Money growing while you sleep. While you're at work, at play, on vacation, unconscious in bed at night, your investments are compounding. Every moment of every day, interest is being calculated, returns are being earned. Growth is happening without any effort on your part. This is why Einstein supposedly called it the eighth wonder of the world. The pyramids required massive human effort. The Great Wall required generations of labour. The Colossus of Rhodes was a triumph of engineering and art. But compound interest? It works automatically. It requires only time and patience. It's a wonder you can set in motion and then ignore, and when you return years later, it will have transformed your small amount into something larger. Of course, there's an equal and opposite truth we'll explore more deeply later. Compound interest works just as powerfully in the other direction when you're in debt. Credit card balances compound against you. Student loans compound against you. The same mathematics that can create wealth can create debt traps. The wonder cuts both ways. But for now, in this gentle space we're creating together, let's rest with the positive side. Let's imagine money growing slowly, steadily, patiently over years and decades. Let's picture Ann Scheiber reading her financial newspapers, watching her modest portfolio grow year by year, knowing she was building something substantial through simple patience. Let's picture Grace Groner going to work each day, those 3 shares of Abbott stock sitting in her account, quietly splitting and growing, turning $180 into a $7 million legacy. These stories aren't fantasies. They happened. They're documented. They demonstrate that the mathematics of compound interest, abstract as it may seem, produces real results in real lives when given enough time. Take a slow breath. Feel the gentle pull of sleep if it's coming. You don't need to hold on to all these numbers and stories. They're here when you need them. The principle underneath all the examples is simple. Money grows over time when invested and left undisturbed. The rate matters, but time matters more, and interrupting the compounding, selling during market crashes. Withdrawing for consumption is the enemy of wealth accumulation. There's a patience required for compound interest that's difficult in our instant gratification culture. You plant the seed and you wait. You don't dig it up every week to see if it's growing. You don't panic when there's a drought and pour all your water on it at once. You tend it gently and consistently, and you wait for the seasons to do their work. This agricultural metaphor isn't accidental. For most of human history, wealth compounding was understood through agriculture. You plant 1 bushel of wheat, you harvest 20 bushels. You keep 2 bushels for next year's seed and store or sell the rest. Next year, planting 2 bushels yields 40 bushels. The year after, 80 bushels. This is compound growth, though limited by land and labour in ways financial compounding is not. The shift to financial assets that can compound indefinitely, unconstrained by physical limitations, is relatively recent in human history. For most people, it only became accessible in the 20th century with the spread of stock markets. Mutual funds and retirement accounts. Anne Scheiber and Grace Groner were among the first generations of ordinary people who could accumulate significant wealth through financial compounding rather than through owning land or businesses. This democratization of compound interest is one of the genuine advances of modern finance. You don't need to be wealthy to benefit from compound growth. You just need access to investment vehicles, which most people in developed economies now have, and you need time and patience. The mathematics works the same whether you start with $100 or $100 million. The percentage returns are identical, only the absolute amounts differ. As we prepare to move forward in our journey, to explore the darker side of compound interest, and then its applications in retirement and wealth building, let yourself rest here for a moment with these stories of patience rewarded. Benjamin Franklin's gift, compounding across 2 centuries. Anne Scheiber's $5,000 becoming $22 million. Grace Groner's 3 shares becoming $7 million. The rice doubling on the chessboard until it exceeds all the rice ever grown. These are parables about time and mathematics. They teach us that small, consistent actions, repeated over long periods, can produce results that seem miraculous. They remind us that patience is a superpower in a world that worships speed. They demonstrate that the 8th wonder, whether Einstein named it or not, is accessible to anyone willing to let time do its work. Breathe slowly. Let your body sink deeper into rest. We've walked through ancient history, through Renaissance mathematics, through modern investment stories. We've seen compound interest revealed in theory and demonstrated in practice. The journey continues, but you can drift now if you need to. The wonder will still be here when you return. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere, right now, investments are compounding. Money is growing. Time is working its patient magic. The 8th wonder is doing what it has always done, turning present into future, small into large. Patience into prosperity. Let that thought settle gently as you drift towards sleep. We've spent time now with the mathematical foundations of compound interest and seen how it worked in the lives of patient, disciplined investors like Anne Scheiber and Grace Groner. But compound interest creates stories that are even more dramatic, more seemingly impossible, more instructive about both the power and the pitfalls of exponential thinking. Let's explore some of these famous examples together, slowly, considering what they teach us and where they might mislead us. The story of Manhattan Island and $24 that we touched on earlier deserves deeper exploration, not because the transaction itself reveals anything profound about compound interest, but because of how we use it to understand or misunderstand exponential growth over very long time periods. The traditional telling treats the purchase as evidence that the Lenape people made a terrible bargain. Manhattan is now worth, by various estimates, somewhere between $1 to $3 trillion in total real estate value. They sold it for the equivalent of $24. What a loss, the story suggests. But let's reverse the calculation with more realistic assumptions. Suppose the Lenape had indeed received $24 in 1626 and had invested it. What rate of return would they have needed to match Manhattan's current value? If we assume Manhattan is worth $1 trillion today, and we calculate what annual return would grow $24 to $1 trillion over roughly 400 years, we get approximately 27% annually, 27% every single year for 4 centuries without interruption. No years of losses, no market crashes, no withdrawals, no fees, perfect compounding at an extraordinarily high rate for an impossibly long time. No investment in human history has achieved this. The stock market averages roughly 9 to 10% over long periods. But with significant volatility and periodic devastating crashes. Even the most successful investors, Warren Buffett, Peter Lynch, John Templeton, have annual returns in the 20 to 25% range over their careers, and none of them maintain that for 4 centuries. So the Manhattan Purchase, viewed through the lens of compound interest, doesn't prove that the Lenape made a bad deal from a purely financial perspective, though obviously the ethical dimensions of colonial land acquisition are far more important than the financial calculations. What it proves is that 400 years is an almost incomprehensibly long time for compounding, and that even at reasonable rates of return, money compounds to astronomical levels over such periods. Let's make this more concrete with a thought experiment. Imagine someone in the year 1626 invested just $1, not 24, just 1, at a modest 7% annual return. That's below the historical stock market average, quite achievable through conservative investments. What would that single dollar be worth today? The answer is approximately $13 billion. $1, 7% annual return, 400 years, becomes $13 billion. This seems impossible, but the mathematics is straightforward. 7% return means your money doubles roughly every 10 years. Over 400 years, that's 40 doublings. $1 doubled 40 times equals 1,99,511,627,776 I've written that number out fully so you can feel its absurdity. More than $1 trillion from a single dollar. But that's what compound interest does over 4 centuries. It takes the small and makes it incomprehensibly large. Of course, no one actually achieved this. There was no way to invest $1 in 1626 and have it compound undisturbed for 400 years. Institutions didn't exist. Currencies changed. Wars disrupted everything. Political systems rose and fell. The very concept of investment as we know it didn't exist in 1626. But the thought experiment reveals something important. Over very long time periods, the compounding rate matters less than you might think, and the time period matters more than you might imagine. The difference between 7% and 10% annual returns over 40 years is significant. Over 400 years, both produce numbers so large as to be meaningless in practical terms. This brings us to another famous compound interest story, one with better documentation and more realistic parameters. Benjamin Franklin's bequest to Boston and Philadelphia. We discussed this earlier, but let's go deeper into what actually happened, because the reality is more instructive than the theory. Franklin specified in his will that the money was to be lent to young married tradesmen at 5% interest. He envisioned a revolving loan fund that would help generation after generation of craftsmen establish themselves. The interest would compound, loans would be repaid, the fund would grow. After 100 years, 3/4 could be spent on public works. After 200 years, the remainder could be spent. Franklin calculated that £1,000 at 5% compound interest would become £131,000 after 100 years. The formula is straightforward. 1,000 times 1.05 raised to the 100th power. Franklin, brilliant mathematician that he was, worked this out by hand. But reality intervened in multiple ways. First, not all borrowers repaid their loans. Some tradesmen failed in their businesses, some died, some simply defaulted. The fund had to pursue collections, write off bad debts, navigate the messy reality of lending to people rather than earning theoretical returns. Second, the loans themselves became more difficult to manage over time. Who would administer them? How would qualified borrowers be identified? What happened when economic conditions changed and the types of tradesmen needing support were different from what Franklin had envisioned? The governance of the fund required constant attention and adaptation. Third, inflation eroded the real value of the returns. 5% nominal return in a period of 3% inflation is only 2% real return. Over a century, this makes an enormous difference. Franklin's calculations didn't account for inflation because the concept wasn't well understood in 1790. Fourth, the very success of the fund created pressures to spend it earlier than Franklin specified. After 50 years, there was substantial money in the fund and there were pressing public needs. The temptation to bend Franklin's rules was constant. To the credit of both Boston and Philadelphia, they largely resisted this temptation, but it shows how difficult it is to maintain multi-generational financial plans. When Boston's fund reached its 100th anniversary in 1890, it was worth about $90,000, not the $131,000 Franklin predicted, and not the $491,000 it would have been if every penny had compounded perfectly at 5%. Still, $90,000 was substantial, enough to establish the Franklin Union, a technical school that served Boston for decades. The remaining quarter of the fund continued compounding for another century. By 1990, it was worth approximately $5 million, enough to fund scholarships and programs to fulfill Franklin's vision of helping young tradesmen, now reinterpreted as helping students learn technical skills. Philadelphia's fund followed a similar trajectory. Not perfect compounding, but substantial growth. Real benefit across generations. A successful experiment in patient capital and compound interest, even if the reality fell short of the theoretical projection. What makes Franklin's bequest so instructive is that it shows compound interest working in the real world, with all the friction and imperfection that entails. The mathematics is clean, the practice is messy. But even messy compound interest, over sufficiently long periods, produces meaningful results. Let's turn now to a different kind of compound interest story. One that's purely mathematical but has captured imaginations for centuries. The story of the grain of rice on the chessboard. We've mentioned this parable before, but let's walk through it slowly, really feeling the exponential growth as we go. A chessboard has 64 squares arranged in an 8x8 grid. The story tells of someone, the details vary, but often it's a clever mathematician or a humble servant who performs a service for a king and is offered a reward. Instead of asking for gold or land or titles, the person makes what seems like a modest request. Place 1 grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard, 2 grains on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, and continue doubling for all 64 squares. The king agrees immediately, thinking this is remarkably humble. A few grains of rice. He expected to give away a kingdom, and he's only giving away dinner. But let's calculate together what the king has actually promised. The first square receives 1 grain. The second square receives 2 grains, for a total so far of 3 grains. The third square receives 4 grains, total now 7 grains. The fourth square receives 8 grains, total now 15 grains. By the 10th square, we're placing 512 grains on that single square, and the total accumulated is 1,023 grains. Still quite manageable, a handful of rice. By the 20th square, we're placing 524,288 grains on that square. The total accumulated is over 1 million grains. Now we're talking about perhaps 20 pounds of rice. Substantial but hardly bankrupting. By the 30th square, we're placing over 500 million grains on that single square. The total accumulated is over 1 billion grains. This is approximately 25 tons of rice. The king is beginning to realize his mistake. By the 40th square, we're placing over 500 billion grains on that square alone. The total accumulated is over 1 trillion grains, approximately 25,000 tons of rice. More rice than was in the entire kingdom. By the 50th square, we're well beyond the rice production of the entire world in a year. By the 60th square, we're beyond all the rice that has ever been grown in human history. And by the 64th square, the final square, we're at a number so large it defies comprehension. The exact total for all 64 squares is 18 quintillion, 446 quadrillion, 744 trillion, 73 billion, 709 million, 551,615 grains of rice. If each grain weighs approximately 20 milligrams, this is roughly 460 billion tons of rice. For comparison, global rice production in a year is approximately 500 million tons. The chessboard would require roughly 900 years of total global rice production. The king cannot fulfill the promise. The kingdom is bankrupted by exponential growth. The story usually ends with the king either executing the clever person for tricking him, or admitting defeat and praising the demonstration of exponential growth, depending on the version. What does this parable teach us about compound interest? Several things, I think. First, exponential growth starts deceptively slowly. The first row of the chessboard, squares 1 through 8, accumulates only 255 grains total. Trivial, you barely notice it. But by the time you reach the end of the second row, you have 65,000 grains. By the end of the fourth row, you have over 4 billion grains. By the end of the eighth row, the end of the board, you have that incomprehensible quintillion. Second, more than half the total is in the final square. Square 64 alone contains more rice than all the previous 63 squares combined. This is always true with exponential growth. The end dominates. The final doubling is larger than all previous doublings added together. Third, human intuition fails completely with exponential growth. Even knowing the rule, doubling each time, our brains can't accurately predict where it leads. We consistently underestimate exponential growth, thinking it will be modest when it will actually be astronomical. Applied to compound interest, these lessons suggest: start early because the early doublings matter even though they seem small. Be patient because the dramatic growth comes near the end. And don't trust your intuition about what long-term compounding will achieve. Run the actual numbers. Let's consider a real-world example that demonstrates these principles. The story of Warren Buffett's wealth accumulation. Warren Buffett is one of the wealthiest people in the world, with a net worth typically around $100 billion, though it fluctuates with market conditions. He's famous as an investor, running Berkshire Hathaway for over 50 years with extraordinary returns. But here's what's remarkable. The vast majority of his wealth was created after age 65. At age 50, Warren Buffett was worth approximately $376 million. Substantial wealth, certainly, but not in the stratosphere of the ultra-rich. He was comfortable, successful, but not yet a household name. At age 60, he was worth approximately $3.8 billion, 10 times richer than at 50, but this was largely from the continued compounding of his earlier investments and the growth of Berkshire Hathaway. But then look what happened. At age 70, his net worth was approximately $30 billion. At age 80, approximately $60 billion. At age 90, approximately $100 billion. Notice the pattern. He accumulated more wealth between age 80 and 90 than he did in the previous 80 years of his life. Not because he suddenly became a better investor in his 80s, he was using the same principles he'd used for decades, but because the compounding finally reached the steep part of the exponential curve. Buffett himself has noted that more than 99% of his net worth was created after his 50th birthday. Think about that. He started investing seriously at age 11, worked at it for nearly 40 years before age 50, and accumulated less than 1% of his eventual wealth in that time. Everything else, 99% of $100 billion, came from the compounding that happened after age 50. This is the chessboard principle in action. The early squares matter because they set up the later squares, but the later squares are where the dramatic numbers appear. Buffett's wealth trajectory looks like a hockey stick. Flat for decades, then a sharp upward curve near the end. Of course, Buffett is an extreme example. His investment returns were unusually high, approximately 20% annually over his career. Most people won't match that, but the principle applies at any return rate. If you start investing in your 20s and continue through your 60s, the majority of your wealth accumulation will likely happen in the final decade before retirement, assuming you don't withdraw the funds and the markets cooperate. This creates a psychological challenge. Young investors contribute faithfully for years and see disappointing balances. They might think compound interest is oversold, that it doesn't really work as advertised. But they're in the first few rows of the chessboard. The dramatic growth is coming, but it requires patience through the slow early years. Let's talk about another famous compound interest story, this one involving the power of starting early versus starting late. It's sometimes called the tale of the twins, though versions vary. Imagine two siblings, both born in the same year. The first sibling starts investing $200 per month at age 25, contributing for exactly 10 years until age 35, then stops contributing entirely but leaves the money invested. Total contributions, $24,000. The second sibling waits until age 35 to start investing, then contributes $200 per month for 30 years straight until age 65. Total contributions, $72,000, 3 times as much as the first sibling. Assume both earn 7% annual return. At age 65, who has more money? The answer surprises most people. The first sibling has more, despite contributing 1/3 as much money and contributing for 1/3 as long. At age 65, the first sibling has approximately $398,000. The second sibling has approximately $244,000. How is this possible? Time. The first sibling's contributions had an extra 25 years to compound. Those early contributions made in the 20s and early 30s compounded through 35 years of growth. The second sibling's contributions, while larger in total, had less time to compound. Let's break down the first sibling's outcome. They contributed $24,000 between age 25 and 35. At age 35, through both contributions and growth, they had approximately $34,000. Then that $34,000 sat untouched for 30 years, compounding at 7% annually. $34,000 compounded for 30 years at 7% becomes approximately $259,000. Plus, the earlier growth during the contribution phase brings the total to about $398,000. The second sibling contributed $72,000 but didn't have as much time for compounding. Earlier contributions had time to grow, but later contributions, the ones made at age 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, had only a few years to compound. This example is somewhat artificial. It assumes the first sibling has the discipline to never contribute another dollar after age 35, which is unlikely and perhaps unwise. But it illustrates a crucial principle. Early contributions are disproportionately valuable. The dollars you invest in your 20s are more valuable in terms of eventual retirement wealth than the dollars you invest in your 50s, assuming equal rates of return. This is why financial advisors constantly emphasize starting early. A 25-year-old investing $100 per month is likely building more retirement wealth than a 45-year-old investing $300 per month, despite the 45-year-old contributing more in absolute terms. Another real-world compound interest story worth exploring involves corporate reinvestment and the power of letting a business compound its earnings. The story of Berkshire Hathaway itself is instructive here. In 1965, Warren Buffett took control of Berkshire Hathaway, which was then a struggling textile manufacturer. The stock price was roughly $18 per share. He transformed it into a holding company that owns insurance companies, utilities, manufacturers, and stakes in other businesses. Berkshire Hathaway has never paid a dividend. All profits have been retained and reinvested. This means shareholders' returns come entirely from stock price appreciation, which reflects the compounding value of the business itself. By 2023, Berkshire Hathaway stock was trading at roughly $550,000 per share. Class A shares, that is. Let me write that out. $550,000 per share. If you had bought one share in 1965 for $18, and held it until 2023, it would be worth $550,000. That's a return of over 30,000 times your initial investment. The annual return works out to approximately 21%, compounded for 58 years. This is the power of retained earnings compounding within a well-managed business. Every dollar of profit that Berkshire kept and reinvested compounded through additional business growth, acquisitions, and investments. Buffett's genius wasn't just in selecting good investments, though he's excellent at that, but in creating a structure that allowed compounding to happen undisturbed. No dividends means no tax burden for shareholders until they sell. No forced distributions means capital can compound at the business level rather than the individual level. It's a compounding machine optimized for long-term wealth creation. This principle applies more broadly. Companies that reinvest their profits tend to compound shareholder value faster than companies that distribute profits as dividends, assuming the reinvestment is done wisely. Amazon reinvested all its profits for years, paying no dividends, and shareholders were rewarded with extraordinary stock price appreciation as the business compounded its revenues and market presence. Let's pause here and take a slow breath. We've explored several famous compound interest stories: the rice and the chessboard, Franklin's bequest, Warren Buffett's wealth trajectory, the tale of the twins, Berkshire Hathaway's never-ending compounding. Each illustrates something about the power of exponential growth over time, but we should acknowledge something important. These are all success stories. They're selected precisely because they demonstrate compound interest working wonderfully well. They're not representative of typical experiences. For every Warren Buffett, there are thousands of investors who earned modest returns or lost money. For every Berkshire Hathaway, there are thousands of companies that went bankrupt. Survivorship bias is a real problem in investment stories. We hear about the successes because they're dramatic and inspirational. We don't hear about the failures because they're depressing and uninteresting. This creates a skewed perception of how easy it is to achieve these outcomes. Moreover, these stories often gloss over the difficulty of maintaining discipline through market downturns. Scheiber held her stocks through the crash of 1987, when the market lost nearly 23% in a single day. She held through the tech bubble bursting in the early 2000s. She held through multiple recessions that required extraordinary psychological fortitude. Most people can't do it. They panic and sell at the worst possible time, turning paper losses into real losses and interrupting the compounding. The stories also require favorable conditions. All these American success stories happened during the Great American Economic Expansion of the 20th century. The stock market had a strong upward trajectory over the long term, despite periodic crashes. Someone investing in the Japanese stock market in 1989 would still be underwater decades later. Someone investing in Russian stocks in the 1990s would have lost everything in various crises. The context matters, and perhaps most importantly, these stories require surplus income to invest in the first place. Scheiber could invest because her pension covered her living expenses. Warren Buffett could accumulate wealth because he had capital to invest from an early age and never needed to withdraw it. Most people face periods where they need to withdraw from savings, for medical emergencies, for children's education, for unexpected expenses. The ability to leave money untouched for decades is itself a privilege. So while these stories are instructive and inspiring, we should hold them lightly. They show what's possible with compound interest, but they don't represent what's typical. They teach principles. Start early, be patient, minimize withdrawals, maintain discipline through volatility. But they don't guarantee outcomes. Let your mind drift gently through these stories now. Picture the grains of rice accumulating on the chessboard, slowly at first, then faster, then incomprehensibly fast. Picture Franklin's £1,000 growing across 2 centuries despite imperfect execution. Picture Scheiber reading her financial newspapers, watching her $5,000 grow into millions. Picture Warren Buffett in his 80s, his wealth accelerating upward despite doing nothing different than he did in his 40s. These are parables about patience and mathematics. They remind us that time is powerful, that small beginnings can lead to large outcomes, that the exponential curve always surprises us with its steepness near the end. They teach us to respect compound interest, to harness it if we can, to be aware of its potential. But they also quietly teach us about what's required: time, discipline, favourable conditions, surplus resources to invest, psychological fortitude to withstand volatility, and often a measure of luck. The mathematics is neutral, but the circumstances that allow the mathematics to work favourably are not equally distributed. As we prepare to move forward into exploring the darker side of compound interest, how it works against borrowers, how it can trap people in debt, how the same wonder that creates wealth can create misery, let yourself rest here for a moment with these success stories. They're beautiful in their way. They show human ingenuity and patience rewarded. They demonstrate mathematical principles made manifest in real lives. Sleep gently, knowing that somewhere right now investments are compounding quietly. Small amounts are becoming larger amounts. Patient capital is doing its slow, powerful work. The eighth wonder is operating according to its timeless mathematical laws, indifferent to our understanding or appreciation, turning present into future. Seed into harvest, patience into prosperity. Breathe slowly. Let these stories settle like sediment through water, eventually coming to rest at the bottom of consciousness. They'll be there when you need them. The principles they teach are simple, even if the outcomes are extraordinary. Start early, stay patient, let time work. That's all, that's everything. Let that simplicity soothe you as you drift towards sleep. We've spent time now with the mathematical foundations of compound interest and seen how it worked in the lives of patient, disciplined investors like Anne Scheiber and Grace Groner. But compound interest creates stories that are even more dramatic, more seemingly impossible, more instructive about both the power and the pitfalls of exponential thinking. Let's explore some of these famous examples together, slowly, considering what they teach us and where they might mislead us. The story of Manhattan Island and $24 that we touched on earlier deserves deeper exploration, not because the transaction itself reveals anything profound about compound interest, but because of how we use it to understand, or misunderstand, exponential growth over very long time periods. The traditional telling treats the purchase as evidence that the Lenape people made a terrible bargain. Manhattan is now worth, by various estimates, somewhere between $1 to $3 trillion in total real estate value. They sold it for the equivalent of $24. What a loss, the story suggests. But let's reverse the calculation with more realistic assumptions. Suppose the Lenape had indeed received $24 in 1626 and had invested it. What rate of return would they have needed to match Manhattan's current value? If we assume Manhattan is worth $1 trillion today, and we calculate what annual return would grow $24 to $1 trillion over roughly 400 years, we get approximately 27% annually. 27% every single year for 4 centuries without interruption. No years of losses, no market crashes, no withdrawals, no fees, perfect compounding at an extraordinarily high rate for an impossibly long time. No investment in human history has achieved this. The stock market averages roughly 9 to 10% over long periods, but with significant volatility and periodic devastating crashes. Even the most successful investors, Warren Buffett, Peter Lynch, John Templeton, have annual returns in the 20 to 25% range over their careers, and none of them maintain that for 4 centuries. So the Manhattan purchase, viewed through the lens of compound interest, doesn't prove that the Lenape made a bad deal from a purely financial perspective, though obviously the ethical dimensions of colonial land acquisition are far more important than the financial calculations. What it proves is that 400 years is an almost incomprehensibly long time for compounding, and that even at reasonable rates of return, money compounds to astronomical levels over such periods. Let's make this more concrete with a thought experiment. Imagine someone in the year 1626 invested just $1, not 24, just 1, at a modest 7% annual return. That's below the historical stock market average, quite achievable through conservative investments. What would that single dollar be worth today? The answer is approximately $13 billion. $1, 7% annual return, 400 years, becomes $13 billion. This seems impossible, but the mathematics is straightforward. 7% return means your money doubles roughly every 10 years. Over 400 years, that's 40 doublings. $1 doubled 40 times equals $1,099,511,627,776. I've written that number out fully so you can feel its absurdity. More than $1 trillion from a single dollar. But that's what compound interest does over 4 centuries. It takes the small and makes it incomprehensibly large. Of course, no one actually achieved this. There was no way to invest $1 in 1626 and have it compound undisturbed for 400 years. Institutions didn't exist. Currencies changed. Wars disrupted everything. Political systems rose and fell. The very concept of investment as we know it didn't exist in 1626. But the thought experiment reveals something important. Over very long time periods, the compounding rate matters less than you might think, and the time period matters more than you might imagine. The difference between 7% and 10% annual returns over 40 years is significant. Over 400 years, both produce numbers so large as to be meaningless in practical terms. This brings us to another famous compound interest story, one with better documentation and more realistic parameters, Benjamin Franklin's bequest to Boston and Philadelphia. We discussed this earlier, but let's go deeper into what actually happened, because the reality is more instructive than the theory. Franklin specified in his will that the money was to be lent to young married tradesmen at 5% interest. He envisioned a revolving loan fund that would help generation after generation of craftsmen establish themselves. The interest would compound, loans would be repaid, the fund would grow. After 100 years, 3/4 could be spent on public works. After 200 years, the remainder could be spent. Franklin calculated that £1,000 at 5% compound interest would become £131,000 after 100 years. The formula is straightforward. 1,000 times 1.05 raised to the 100th power. Franklin, brilliant mathematician that he was, worked this out by hand. But reality intervened in multiple ways. First, not all borrowers repaid their loans. Some tradesmen failed in their businesses, some died, some simply defaulted. The fund had to pursue collections, write off bad debts, navigate the messy reality of lending to people, rather than earning theoretical returns. Second, the loans themselves became more difficult to manage over time. Who would administer them? How would qualified borrowers be identified? What happened when economic conditions changed and the types of tradesmen needing support were different from what Franklin had envisioned? The governance of the fund required constant attention and adaptation. Third, inflation eroded the real value of the returns. 5% nominal return in a period of 3% inflation is only 2% real return. Over a century, this makes an enormous difference. Franklin's calculations didn't account for inflation because the concept wasn't well understood in 1790. Fourth, the very success of the fund created pressures to spend it earlier than Franklin specified. After 50 years, there was substantial money in the fund and there were pressing public needs. The temptation to bend Franklin's rules was constant. To the credit of both Boston and Philadelphia, they largely resisted this temptation, but it shows how difficult it is to maintain multi-generational financial plans. When Boston's fund reached its 100th anniversary in 1890, it was worth about $90,000, not the $131,000 Franklin predicted, and not the $491,000 it would have been if every penny had compounded perfectly at 5%. Still, $90,000 was substantial, enough to establish the Franklin Union, a technical school that served Boston for decades. The remaining quarter of the fund continued compounding for another century. By 1990, it was worth approximately $5 million, enough to fund scholarships and programs to fulfill Franklin's vision of helping young tradesmen, now reinterpreted as helping students learn technical skills. Philadelphia's fund followed a similar trajectory. Not perfect compounding, but substantial growth. Real benefit across generations. A successful experiment in patient capital and compound interest, even if the reality fell short of the theoretical projection. What makes Franklin's bequest so instructive is that it shows compound interest working in the real world, with all the friction and imperfection that entails. The mathematics is clean, the practice is messy. But even messy compound interest over sufficiently long periods produces meaningful results. Let's turn now to a different kind of compound interest story, one that's purely mathematical, but has captured imaginations for centuries. The story of the grain of rice on the chessboard. We've mentioned this parable before, but let's walk through it slowly, really feeling the exponential growth as we go. A chessboard has 64 squares arranged in an 8x8 grid. The story tells of someone. The details vary, but often it's a clever mathematician or a humble servant who performs a service for a king and is offered a reward. Instead of asking for gold or land or titles, the person makes what seems like a modest request. Place 1 grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard, 2 grains on the second square, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, and continue doubling for all 64 squares. The king agrees immediately, thinking this is remarkably humble. A few grains of rice. He expected to give away a kingdom, and he's only giving away dinner. But let's calculate together what the king has actually promised. The first square receives 1 grain. The second square receives 2 grains, for a total so far of 3 grains. The third square receives 4 grains, total now 7 grains. The fourth square receives 8 grains, total now 15 grains. By the 10th square, we're placing 512 grains on that single square, and the total accumulated is 1,023 grains. Still quite manageable, a handful of rice. By the 20th square, we're placing 524,288 grains on that square. The total accumulated is over 1 million grains. Now we're talking about perhaps 20 pounds of rice. Substantial, but hardly bankrupting. By the 30th square, we're placing over 500 million grains on that single square. The total accumulated is over 1 billion grains. This is approximately 25 tons of rice. The king is beginning to realize his mistake. By the 40th square, we're placing over 500 billion grains on that square alone. The total accumulated is over 1 trillion grains, approximately 25,000 tons of rice. More rice than was in the entire kingdom. By the 50th square, we're well beyond the rice production of the entire world in a year. By the 60th square, we're beyond all the rice that has ever been grown in human history. And by the 64th square, the final square, we're at a number so large it defies comprehension. The exact total for all 64 squares is 18 quintillion, 446 quadrillion, 744 trillion, 73 billion, 709,551,615 grains of rice. If each grain weighs approximately 20 milligrams, this is roughly 460 billion tons of rice. For comparison, global rice production in a year is approximately 500 million tons. The chessboard would require roughly 900 years of total global rice production. The king cannot fulfill the promise. The kingdom is bankrupted by exponential growth. The story usually ends with the king either executing the clever person for tricking him or admitting defeat and praising the demonstration of exponential growth, depending on the version. What does this parable teach us about compound interest? Several things, I think. First, exponential growth starts deceptively slowly. The first row of the chessboard, squares 1 through 8, accumulates only 255 grains total. Trivial, you barely notice it. But by the time you reach the end of the second row, you have 65,000 grains. By the end of the fourth row, you have over 4 billion grains. By the end of the eighth row, the end of the board, you have that incomprehensible quintillion. Second, more than half the total is in the final square. Square 64 alone contains more rice than all the previous 63 squares combined. This is always true with exponential growth. The end dominates. The final doubling is larger than all previous doublings added together. Third, human intuition fails completely with exponential growth. Even knowing the rule, doubling each time, our brains can't accurately predict where it leads. We consistently underestimate exponential growth, thinking it will be modest when it will actually be astronomical. Applied to compound interest, these lessons suggest: start early, because the early doublings matter even though they seem small. Be patient because the dramatic growth comes near the end, and don't trust your intuition about what long-term compounding will achieve. Run the actual numbers. Let's consider a real-world example that demonstrates these principles. The story of Warren Buffett's wealth accumulation. Warren Buffett is one of the wealthiest people in the world, with a net worth typically around $100 billion, though it fluctuates with market conditions. He's famous as an investor, running Berkshire Hathaway for over 50 years with extraordinary returns. But here's what's remarkable. The vast majority of his wealth was created after age 65. At age 50, Warren Buffett was worth approximately $376 million. Substantial wealth, certainly, but not in the stratosphere of the ultra-rich. He was comfortable, successful, but not yet a household name. At age 60, he was worth approximately $3.8 billion, 10 times richer than at 50, but this was largely from the continued compounding of his earlier investments and the growth of Berkshire Hathaway. But then look what happened. At age 70, his net worth was approximately $30 billion. At age 80, approximately $60 billion. At age 90, approximately $100 billion. Notice the pattern. He accumulated more wealth between age 80 and 90 than he did in the previous 80 years of his life. Not because he suddenly became a better investor in his 80s, he was using the same principles he'd used for decades, but because the compounding finally reached the steep part of the exponential curve. Buffett himself has noted that more than 99% of his net worth was created after his 50th birthday. Think about that. He started investing seriously at age 11, worked at it for nearly 40 years before age 50, and accumulated less than 1% of his eventual wealth in that time. Everything else, 99% of $100 billion, came from the compounding that happened after age 50. This is the chessboard principle in action. The early squares matter because they set up the later squares, but the later squares are where the dramatic numbers appear. Buffett's wealth trajectory looks like a hockey stick, flat for decades, then a sharp upward curve near the end. Of course, Buffett is an extreme example. His investment returns were unusually high, approximately 20% annually over his career. Most people won't match that, but the principle applies at any return rate. If you start investing in your 20s and continue through your 60s, the majority of your wealth accumulation will likely happen in the final decade before retirement, assuming you don't withdraw the funds and the markets cooperate. This creates a psychological challenge. Young investors contribute faithfully for years and see disappointing balances. They might think compound interest is oversold, that it doesn't really work as advertised. But they're in the first few rows of the chessboard. The dramatic growth is coming, but it requires patience through the slow early years. Let's talk about another famous compound interest story, this one involving the power of starting early versus starting late. It's sometimes called the tale of the twins, though versions vary. Imagine two siblings, both born in the same year. The first sibling starts investing $200 per month at age 25. contributing for exactly 10 years until age 35, then stops contributing entirely, but leaves the money invested. Total contributions, $24,000. The second sibling waits until age 35 to start investing, then contributes $200 per month for 30 years straight until age 65. Total contributions, $72,000, 3 times as much as the first sibling. Assume both earned 7% annual return. At age 65, who has more money? The answer surprises most people. The first sibling has more, despite contributing 1/3 as much money and contributing for 1/3 as long. At age 65, the first sibling has approximately $398,000. The second sibling has approximately $244,000. How is this possible? Time. The first sibling's contributions had an extra 25 years to compound. Those early contributions made in the 20s and early 30s compounded through 35 years of growth. The second sibling's contributions, while larger in total, had less time to compound. Let's break down the first sibling's outcome. They contributed $24,000 between age 25 and 35. At age 35, through both contributions and growth, they had approximately $34,000. Then that $34,000 sat untouched for 30 years, compounding at 7% annually. $34,000 compounded for 30 years at 7% becomes approximately $259,000. Plus the earlier growth during the contribution phase brings the total to about $398,000. The second sibling contributed $72,000, but didn't have as much time for compounding. Earlier contributions had time to grow, but later contributions, the ones made at age 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, had only a few years to compound. This example is somewhat artificial. It assumes the first sibling has the discipline to never contribute another dollar after age 35, which is unlikely and perhaps unwise. But it illustrates a crucial principle. Early contributions are disproportionately valuable. The dollars you invest in your 20s are more valuable, in terms of your eventual retirement wealth, than the dollars you invest in your 50s, assuming equal rates of return. This is why financial advisors constantly emphasize starting early. A 25-year-old investing $100 per month is likely building more retirement wealth than a 45-year-old investing $300 per month, despite the 45-year-old contributing more in absolute terms. Another real-world compound interest story worth exploring involves corporate reinvestment and the power of letting a business compound its earnings. The story of Berkshire Hathaway itself is instructive here. In 1965, Warren Buffett took control of Berkshire Hathaway, which was then a struggling textile manufacturer. The stock price was roughly $18 per share. He transformed it into a holding company that owns insurance companies, utilities, manufacturers, and stakes in other businesses. Berkshire Hathaway has never paid a dividend. All profits have been retained and reinvested. This means shareholders' returns come entirely from stock price appreciation, which reflects the compounding value of the business itself. By 2023, Berkshire Hathaway stock was trading at roughly $550,000 per share. Class A shares, that is. Let me write that out. $550,000 per share. If you had bought one share in 1965 for $18 and held it until 2023, it would be worth $550,000. That's a return of over 30,000 times your initial investment. The annual return works out to approximately 21%, compounded for 58 years. This is the power of retained earnings compounding within a well-managed business. Every dollar of profit that Berkshire kept and reinvested compounded through additional business growth, acquisitions, and investments. Buffett's genius wasn't just in selecting good investments, though he's excellent at that, but in creating a structure that allowed compounding to happen undisturbed. No dividends means no tax burden for shareholders until they sell. No forced distributions means capital can compound at the business level rather than the individual level. It's a compounding machine optimized for long-term wealth creation. This principle applies more broadly. Companies that reinvest their profits tend to compound shareholder value faster than companies that distribute profits as dividends, assuming the reinvestment is done wisely. Amazon reinvested all its profits for years, paying no dividends, and shareholders were rewarded with extraordinary stock price appreciation as the business compounded its revenues and market presence. Let's pause here and take a slow breath. We've explored several famous compound interest stories: the rice and the chessboard, Franklin's bequest, Warren Buffett's wealth trajectory, the tale of the twins, Berkshire Hathaway's never-ending compounding. Each illustrates something about the power of exponential growth over time. But we should acknowledge something important. These are all success stories. They're selected precisely because they demonstrate compound interest working wonderfully well. They're not representative of typical experiences. For every Warren Buffett, there are thousands of investors who earned modest returns or lost money. For every Berkshire Hathaway, there are thousands of companies that went bankrupt. Survivorship bias is a real problem in investment stories. We hear about the successes because they're dramatic and inspirational. We don't hear about the failures because they're depressing and uninteresting. This creates a skewed perception of how easy it is to achieve these outcomes. Moreover, these stories often gloss over the difficulty of maintaining discipline through market downturns. Scheiber held her stocks through the crash of 1987, when the market lost nearly 23% in a single day. She held through the tech bubble bursting in the early 2000s. She held through multiple recessions. That required extraordinary psychological fortitude. Most people can't do it. They panic and sell at the worst possible time, turning paper losses into real losses and interrupting the compounding. The stories also require favourable conditions. All these American success stories happened during the great American economic expansion of the 20th century. The stock market had a strong upward trajectory over the long term, despite periodic crashes. Someone investing in the Japanese stock market in 1989 would still be underwater decades later. Someone investing in Russian stocks in the 1990s would have lost everything in various crises. The context matters. And perhaps most importantly, these stories require surplus income to invest in the first place. Scheiber could invest because her pension covered her living expenses. Warren Buffett could accumulate wealth because he had capital to invest from an early age and never needed to withdraw it. Most people face periods where they need to withdraw from savings, for medical emergencies, for children's education, for unexpected expenses. The ability to leave money untouched for decades is itself a privilege. So while these stories are instructive and inspiring, we should hold them lightly. They show what's possible with compound interest, but they don't represent what's typical. They teach principles: start early, be patient, minimize withdrawals, maintain discipline through volatility, but they don't guarantee outcomes. Let your mind drift gently through these stories now. Picture the grains of rice accumulating on the chessboard, slowly at first, then faster, then incomprehensibly fast. Picture Franklin's £1,000 growing across 2 centuries, despite imperfect execution. Picture Scheiber reading her financial newspapers, watching her $5,000 grow into millions. Picture Warren Buffett in his 80s, his wealth accelerating upward despite doing nothing different than he did in his 40s. These are parables about patience and mathematics. They remind us that time is powerful, that small beginnings can lead to large outcomes, that the exponential curve always surprises us with its steepness near the end. They teach us to respect compound interest, to harness it if we can, to be aware of its potential. But they also quietly teach us about what's required: time, discipline, favourable conditions, surplus resources to invest, psychological fortitude to withstand volatility, and often a measure of luck. The mathematics is neutral, but the circumstances that allow the mathematics to work favourably are not equally distributed. As we prepare to move forward into exploring the darker side of compound interest, how it works against borrowers, how it can trap people in debt, how the same wonder that creates wealth can create misery. Let yourself rest here for a moment with these success stories. They're beautiful in their way. They show human ingenuity and patience rewarded. They demonstrate mathematical principles made manifest in real lives. Sleep gently, knowing that somewhere right now investments are compounding quietly. Small amounts are becoming larger amounts. Patient capital is doing its slow, powerful work. The eighth wonder is operating according to its timeless mathematical laws, indifferent to our understanding or appreciation, turning present into future, seed into harvest, patience into prosperity. Breathe slowly. Let these stories settle like sediment through water, eventually coming to rest at the bottom of consciousness. They'll be there when you need them. The principles they teach are simple, even if the outcomes are extraordinary. Start early, stay patient, let time work. That's all. That's everything. Let that simplicity soothe you as you drift towards sleep. We've spent time exploring the bright side of compound interest, the stories of patient accumulation and wealth building that inspire and instruct. But now we need to turn and look at the shadow, at the other face of this eighth wonder, because compound interest is perfectly neutral. It's just mathematics, and mathematics doesn't care whether it's working for you or against you. The same exponential curve that can lift you to prosperity can drag you into a pit of debt so deep that escape seems impossible. Let's begin gently with the most common form of compound interest working against ordinary people in modern life: credit card debt. Imagine you have a credit card with a balance of $5,000. This is not an unusual amount. Many Americans carry credit card balances in this range or higher. The annual percentage rate on this card is 18%, which is actually below average for credit cards. Many charge 20 to 25% or even higher. Now suppose you make only the minimum payment each month. Credit card companies typically set minimum payments at around 2 to 3% of the balance. Let's say 3% to be generous. On a $5,000 balance, that's $150 per month. You might think, I'm paying $150 per month, so I'm reducing my debt by $150 per month. I'll have this paid off in 34 months. But that's not how it works. That's not how compound interest works when it's working against you. Of your $150 payment, a significant portion goes to interest. At 18% annual rate, the monthly interest rate is 1.5%. 1.5% of $5,000 is $75. So of your $150 payment, $75 goes to interest, and only $75 goes to reducing the principal. Next month, you owe $4,925. The interest on that is about $73.88. Your $150 payment now puts $73.88 toward interest and $76.12 toward principal. You're making progress, but slowly, painfully slowly. If you continue making minimum payments of 3% of the balance, and if you never add another charge to this card, it will take you approximately 14 years to pay off the $5,000 debt. 14 years, and you'll have paid approximately $3,700 in interest. You'll pay a total of $8,700 to retire a $5,000 debt. This is compound interest in reverse. Each month, interest accrues on the remaining balance. That interest is added to the balance. Next month, you pay interest on the interest from last month. It compounds against you. Now let's make this worse, because this is how it often happens in real life. Suppose you can't quite afford the $150 minimum payment some months. You pay $100 instead, or $90, or you miss a payment entirely. Most credit cards have penalty fees for late payments, typically $25 to $40. That penalty is added to your balance. Now you're paying interest on the penalty fee too. And if you miss a payment, many cards increase your interest rate to the penalty rate, which can be as high as 29.99%. Now your monthly interest on a $5,000 balance is around $125. Your entire minimum payment barely covers the interest. The principal hardly moves at all. You're treading water, paying month after month and getting nowhere. This is the debt trap, and millions of people live in it. They owe money, they make payments. The balance never seems to go down. Years pass. They've paid thousands of dollars and still owe nearly as much as they started with. It's not because they're financially irresponsible or mathematically ignorant. It's because compound interest, when it works against you, is devastatingly powerful. Credit card companies understand this perfectly. They design their business model around it. They want you to carry a balance. They want you to make minimum payments. They profit from the compound interest accumulating month after month, year after year. The person paying off their balance in full every month is not a profitable customer for them. The person carrying a balance for years is extraordinarily profitable. Let's compare two scenarios to see the difference compound interest makes. Suppose you charge $5,000 on a credit card for a necessary expense, car repair, medical bill, something unavoidable. Scenario 1. You pay it off in full when the bill comes. You pay $5,000 total, no interest. Done. Scenario 2. You pay minimum payments over 14 years. You pay $8,700 total. $3,700 of that is pure interest, money you paid for the privilege of carrying debt. That $3,700 represents compound interest working against you. It's money that could have been saved, invested, used for other purposes. Instead, it went to the credit card company as profit. Now imagine you have not one credit card but three, each carrying balances. Imagine you're making minimum payments on student loans, car loans, and credit cards simultaneously. The compound interest accumulating across all these debts can consume a huge portion of your income. People find themselves in situations where they're working full-time, making payments on multiple debts, and still falling further behind as interest compounds faster than they can pay it down. Let's talk about payday loans, which represent an even more predatory form of compound interest. Payday loans are short-term, high-interest loans marketed to people who need cash before their next paycheck. The typical structure is borrow $300, pay back $345 in 2 weeks. That $45 fee might seem modest. It's only 15% of the loan amount. But remember, this is for 2 weeks, not a year. If you calculate the annual percentage rate, it works out to approximately 390%. 390%. At 390% annual interest, money doubles in roughly 3 months. If you rolled over a $300 payday loan for a year, borrowing to pay back the previous loan, again and again, you'd end up owing approximately $12,000 on the original $300 loan. Of course, no one intentionally rolls over a payday loan for a full year. But people do get trapped in cycles where they take out a payday loan, can't pay it back in 2 weeks, so they take out another payday loan to pay off the first one plus a fee, then another to pay off that one. Each time, the fees accumulate. The compound interest, calculated over these very short periods at very high rates, destroys people financially. Payday lenders target low-income neighborhoods. They set up shop near military bases, near poor communities, places where people have limited access to traditional banking and credit. They exploit desperation, and they profit enormously from compound interest working against the most vulnerable. There are entire communities where significant portions of the population are trapped in payday loan cycles, paying hundreds or thousands of dollars in interest and fees each year on loans that never get paid off, just rolled over endlessly. It's a form of modern debt peonage, and compound interest is the mechanism that makes it work. Let's turn now to student loans, which affect millions of Americans and demonstrate how compound interest can transform education debt into lifelong burden. Suppose a student graduates with $40,000 in student loan debt at 6% interest. This is actually below the current average. Many students have much more debt, and federal student loan rates have been as high as 7 to 8% in recent years. But let's use these numbers. On a standard 10-year repayment plan, the monthly payment would be approximately $444. Over 10 years, the student would pay approximately $53,280 total. $13,280 of that is interest. But many students can't afford $444 per month when they're just starting their careers. So they choose income-based repayment plans, where the payment is calculated based on their income, typically 10 to 15% of discretionary income. For a young graduate making $30,000 per year, this might result in a payment of $150 to $200 per month. Here's the problem. At $200 per month, the payment doesn't cover the accruing interest. 6% annual interest on $40,000 is $2,400 per year, or $200 per month. The entire payment goes to interest. None of it reduces the principal. The balance doesn't go down. In fact, if there are any fees or if the payment is slightly less than the accruing interest, the balance goes up. Negative amortization. Students make payments for years and watch their loan balance increase rather than decrease. They're on a treadmill, running hard and going backward. This is deeply demoralizing. It creates a sense of hopelessness, of being trapped in debt forever with no escape. Some income-based repayment plans offer loan forgiveness after 20 or 25 years of payments, but the forgiven amount is currently treated as taxable income. So after paying on a loan for 25 years, watching the balance grow to perhaps $80,000 or $90,000 through compound interest, the borrower might receive a tax bill for $20,000 to $30,000 on the forgiven amount. The debt trap has a trap door, and there's another trap underneath. The student loan crisis in America, roughly $1.6 trillion in outstanding student debt as of the early 2020s, is fundamentally a compound interest crisis. Students borrowed amounts that seemed manageable, but compound interest over decades transformed those manageable amounts into crushing burdens. The mathematics worked against them, and the systems that were supposed to educate them instead indebted them. Let's talk about mortgages, because even good debt demonstrates how compound interest extracts wealth over time, though in less obviously predatory ways than credit cards or payday loans. Suppose you buy a house for $300,000 with a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage at 4% interest. You put 20% down, $60,000, and borrow $240,000. Your monthly payment for principal and interest is approximately $1,146. Over 30 years, you'll make 360 payments totaling approximately $412,560. Of that, $240,000 is repaying the borrowed principal. $172,560 is interest. Think about that. You borrowed $240,000. You pay back $412,560. The bank receives $172,560 in interest. That's compound interest working over 3 decades. Now look at how the payments are structured. In the first payment, approximately $800 goes to interest and only $346 goes to principal. In the second payment, very similar. Most goes to interest, little goes to principal. This is called amortization. Early in the loan, almost all of your payment is interest. Only near the end does the balance start decreasing quickly. This means if you sell the house after 5 years, which many people do, you've made 60 payments totaling about $68,760, but you've only reduced your loan balance by about $21,000. $47,000 went to interest. You paid the bank $47,000 to borrow money for 5 years. This isn't necessarily predatory. 4% is a reasonable rate, and you got to live in the house, and you might have benefited from appreciation in the home's value. But it shows how compound interest extracts value, even in ordinary, accepted financial transactions. And if you refinance your mortgage, which many people do to get lower rates or access equity, you often restart the amortization schedule. You go back to making payments that are mostly interest. The bank loves this. You pay interest on interest and the principal hardly budges for years. There's a darker history we should acknowledge about mortgages and compound interest in America. During the early to mid-20th century, a practice called redlining prevented Black Americans and other minorities from getting mortgages in certain neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Administration and banks literally drew red lines on maps around minority neighborhoods and refused to lend there. This meant that black families couldn't buy homes in appreciating neighborhoods, couldn't build wealth through home equity, couldn't benefit from the compound growth of home values that built middle-class wealth for white families. Meanwhile, they often had to rent at higher costs or buy on predatory contract for deed arrangements that charged higher interest and offered no equity accumulation. The compound interest working for white homeowners, their mortgages paying down while their home values appreciated, wasn't available to black families, and the compound interest working against them, higher rents, predatory lending, no asset accumulation, was very much present. Over generations, this created wealth gaps that compound interest amplified decade after decade. By the time redlining was officially outlawed in the 1960s, several generations of wealth accumulation through home equity had already happened for white families and been denied to black families. The compound effect of this discrimination echoes through to today, contributing to persistent racial wealth gaps. Let's talk about the company store and debt peonage, because compound interest has a long history of trapping workers. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mining companies and textile mills in rural areas often paid workers partly in scrip, company currency that could only be spent at the company store. The company store sold necessities, food, clothing, tools, at inflated prices. Workers would buy on credit, promising to pay from future wages, but their wages were low and the prices were high and interest accumulated on the debt. Workers would labour for weeks and find that their entire paycheck went to the company store to pay down debt, leaving them with nothing. So they'd buy more on credit, going deeper into debt. The compound interest on the store debt meant that hard-working people could never get out from under it. This system was designed to trap workers. The company owned the housing, the store, and the payroll. If you tried to leave, the company could claim you owed unpaid debts and have you arrested. The compound interest on those debts made escape impossible. You worked. But you never got ahead. Your labour enriched the company while debt, growing through compound interest, kept you bound. This sounds like ancient history, but modern equivalents exist. Rent-to-own furniture and appliances charge interest rates that can exceed 100% annually. Low-income people without access to credit buy a refrigerator or a couch on a rent-to-own plan, making weekly or monthly payments. By the time it's paid off, they've paid 3 or 4 times what the item would have cost if purchased outright. Compound interest has extracted wealth from people who had little to begin with. Subprime auto loans work similarly. People with poor credit need a car to get to work. They can only qualify for high-interest auto loans, sometimes 15, 20, even 25%. They make payments for years, and if they miss a payment, the car is repossessed. They've paid thousands in interest and lost the car and still owe money. Compound interest at these rates means the vast majority of their payments went to interest, building equity for the lender, while building nothing for the borrower. Medical debt compounds in complex ways too. Hospital bills are often negotiated at inflated rates, then payment plans are arranged with interest. Collections agencies buy medical debt for pennies on the dollar, then charge interest and fees as they pursue collection. People who suffered a medical emergency and couldn't pay the bill find themselves years later still being pursued for debt that has compounded to several times the original amount. There's a pattern across all these examples. Compound interest amplifies inequality. If you have money to invest, compound interest works for you, building wealth while you sleep. If you need to borrow money, compound interest works against you, extracting wealth while you struggle to pay it back. This isn't a moral judgment on individual borrowers or lenders. It's a structural observation about how compound interest operates in systems with inequality. Those who start with surplus can invest and compound. Those who start with deficit must borrow and pay compound interest, which increases the deficit, which requires more borrowing, which compounds the problem. The mathematics is neutral, but the outcomes are not. Compound interest, operating over time in an unequal society, tends to increase inequality. The rich compound their wealth, the poor compound their debts. Both processes accelerate over time, driving the groups further apart. Let's sit with this uncomfortable truth for a moment. Breathe slowly. This isn't meant to create anxiety or despair, but to understand how the same mathematical principle we've been celebrating can create suffering when it operates in the other direction. There's something almost cruel about compound interest when it works against you. You make payments, you're trying, you're being responsible. But the math doesn't care about your effort. It just calculates coldly. Principal times interest rate times time. The debt grows according to exponential curves that overwhelm human effort. People trapped in debt often describe feeling like they're drowning. They work multiple jobs, they skip meals to save money, they make payments regularly, and still the balance doesn't seem to go down, or goes down so slowly that it feels hopeless. This isn't laziness or irresponsibility. This is compound interest operating against someone who doesn't have enough surplus income to overcome the exponential curve. The psychological toll is enormous. Debt stress affects mental health, physical health, relationships, and quality of life. People lose sleep worrying about debt. They feel shame and failure even when their debt resulted from circumstances beyond their control, medical emergencies, job loss, family crises. The compound interest doesn't care about circumstances. It just compounds. There are ways to fight back against compound interest working against you, though they require resources many people don't have. Paying more than the minimum on debts focuses payments on principal, reducing the base on which interest compounds. Paying off highest interest debts first, the _5_ minimizes total interest paid over time. Refinancing high interest debt into lower interest debt, when possible, can save thousands in compound interest. But all of these strategies require having extra money to put toward debt, which many people simply don't have. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, there's no extra. The minimum payments are all you can afford. You're stuck on the treadmill, and compound interest keeps the treadmill moving faster than you can run. This is why financial education, while valuable, isn't a complete solution. You can understand perfectly how compound interest works and still be trapped by it if you don't have sufficient income. The problem isn't knowledge, the problem is structural. Let's acknowledge something else. The institutions that profit from compound interest working against people, credit card companies, payday lenders, subprime auto lenders, know exactly what they're doing. They employ mathematicians and data scientists to optimize their lending practices for maximum profit. They've calculated precisely how to extract the most money from borrowers over time. They know that offering minimum payments creates long-term customers. They know that high interest rates on desperate borrowers produces enormous profits. They know that complexity and confusion work in their favor. The more complicated the terms, the less likely borrowers are to understand what they're signing up for. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's business model. And compound interest is the engine that makes it work. Take a desperate person, lend them money at high interest, structure the payment so the debt doesn't decrease quickly, and compound interest does the rest. Wait, collect, profit. There are regulations meant to prevent the worst abuses. Interest rate caps exist in many jurisdictions. Truth in lending laws require disclosure of annual percentage rates. But predatory lending persists, often finding loopholes or operating in grey areas where regulation is weak. And even non-predatory lending, regular credit cards, student loans, mortgages with reasonable rates, still extracts significant wealth through compound interest over time. The person lending money and earning compound interest gains wealth. The person borrowing money and paying compound interest loses wealth. Both processes accelerate over time, creating divergent outcomes that compound across years and generations. Take a slow breath now. Let the weight of this reality settle, but don't let it crush you. Understanding how compound interest works against borrowers is important. It creates empathy for those trapped in debt. It reveals systemic issues that individual effort can't fully solve. It shows why debt relief, interest rate regulation, and progressive taxation matter. But it's also important not to despair. People do escape debt. Systems do change. The cruelty of compound interest working against the vulnerable isn't inevitable. It's a choice societies make through policy and regulation. Different choices are possible. As we prepare to move forward to explore how compound interest can work for people through retirement savings and long-term investing, carry this awareness of the shadow side. The eighth wonder cuts both ways. It can build or destroy, liberate or enslave, depending on which side of the debt equation you're on. Let yourself rest now in this knowledge. Compound interest is powerful. It's neutral. It operates according to mathematical laws that don't care about justice or fairness. But we're not helpless before it. We can structure systems to protect the vulnerable from predatory compound interest. We can create opportunities for more people to benefit from investment compound interest. We can make choices, individual and collective, that determine whether compound interest works for us or against us. Sleep gently, knowing that this wonder, this eighth wonder, is a tool. Like fire, it can warm or burn. Like water, it can sustain life or cause floods. The mathematics doesn't change, but how we use it, how we regulate it, how we ensure it serves human flourishing rather than human suffering. These are choices we make together. Breathe slowly. The dark side of compound interest is real, but it's not the only reality. Tomorrow we'll explore the brighter applications, the ways ordinary people can harness this power for security and prosperity. But for now, rest with this fuller understanding. The wonder is wonderful, but it's also dangerous. Both truths deserve our attention and our respect. We've walked through the shadow side of compound interest, seen how it can trap and burden and extract wealth from those who can least afford it. But now let's turn back toward the light, toward how compound interest can work for ordinary people, not against them. Because for all the dangers we've discussed, compound interest remains the most reliable pathway to financial security that most people will ever have access to. Let's explore how this works, gently and without pressure, understanding the mechanisms that can transform modest savings into comfortable retirement. The story begins with an accident, a quirk of tax law that created something no one quite intended, the story of the 401k retirement account. In 1978, Congress passed the Revenue Act, a piece of tax legislation meant to address various issues in the tax code. Buried in this legislation was a small provision, Section 401, subsection K, that allowed employees to defer receiving some of their income until retirement. The intent was to give executives a way to defer bonuses and avoid paying taxes on them until later years when they might be in lower tax brackets. But a benefits consultant named Ted Benner saw something else in this obscure tax provision. He realized it could be used to create a new kind of retirement plan. Instead of traditional pensions, where the company promised to pay defined benefits in retirement, employers could allow workers to contribute part of their salary to an investment account. The contributions would be tax deductible, reducing current income tax. The money would grow tax deferred, no taxes on dividends, interest or capital gains until withdrawal, and employers could match employee contributions, providing an incentive to participate. The first 401k plan was created in 1981. Within a few years, thousands of companies were offering them. Today, tens of millions of Americans participate in 401k plans or similar tax-deferred retirement accounts. The entire retirement landscape shifted from pensions to defined contribution plans, often without workers fully understanding the implications. But here's what's remarkable. 401k accounts are optimized for compound interest. Money goes in regularly through payroll deductions. It's invested in stocks, bonds, or mutual funds. Dividends and capital gains are automatically reinvested. Taxes don't interrupt the compounding. The money just sits and grows, year after year, decade after decade. Let's walk through a realistic example together. Suppose someone starts working at age 25, earning $40,000 per year. They enroll in their company's 401k plan and contribute 6% of their salary, $2,400 per year, or $200 per month. The company matches 50 cents on the dollar up to 6%, adding another 3%, $1,200 per year. So the total contribution is $3,600 per year, $2,400 from the employee, $1,200 from the employer. The money's invested in a target date retirement fund that averages 7% annual return over the decades. After 1 year, the account has approximately $3,600 plus a small amount of investment return. Not impressive yet. After 5 years, assuming no salary increases, the account has roughly $21,000. After 10 years, approximately $50,000. Still feels modest. But watch what happens with more time. After 20 years, the account has approximately $148,000. After 30 years, about $346,000. After 40 years, at age 65, approximately $765,000. Let's pause and examine this. The employee contributed $2,400 per year for 40 years, $96,000 total out of their own paycheck. The employer contributed $1,200 per year for 40 years, $48,000 total. Combined contributions, $144,000. The account is worth $765,000. The difference, $621,000, came entirely from compound investment returns. The contributions represent less than 20% of the final value. More than 80% came from the investments growing, the dividends reinvesting, the compound interest working year after year. This is the retirement miracle. Modest contributions sustained over decades, compounding into amounts that can support 20 or 30 years of retirement. It's not magic, it's mathematics. But the outcome feels miraculous to someone who contributed $200 per month and ended up with $750,000. Now let's make this more realistic by including salary increases. Most people don't earn the same salary for 40 years. They get raises, promotions, cost of living adjustments. Suppose our worker's salary increases by 3% per year on average, roughly tracking inflation. Starting salary, $40,000. After 10 years, about $54,000. After 20 years, about $72,000. After 30 years, about $97,000. After 40 years, about $130,000. The 401k contributions increase along with salary, always 6% from the employee, 3% employer match. With these increasing contributions and the same 7% investment return, the account at age 65 is worth approximately $1.4 million. The total contributions over 40 years, employee plus employer, are about $280,000. The account value is $1.4 million. The compound returns created over $1 million in wealth from $280,000 in contributions. This is how middle-class retirement wealth gets built in America today. Not through inheritance or windfalls, but through steady contributions to retirement accounts that compound over decades. The system isn't perfect, we'll discuss its limitations, but for millions of people, it works. The key insight is that you don't need to be wealthy to benefit from compound interest in retirement accounts. You need 3 things: time, consistency, and patience. Time means starting early. Consistency means contributing regularly. Patience means not panicking during market downturns and withdrawing the money. Let's talk about that employer match, because it's one of the most valuable but underutilized aspects of retirement savings. When an employer matches your contributions, that's an immediate return on investment. If you contribute $100 and your employer matches $50, you immediately have $150. That's a 50% instant return. Some employers offer even more generous matches, dollar for dollar up to a certain percentage, or 50 cents on the dollar up to higher percentages. This is free money. It's part of your compensation. Not taking advantage of it is leaving money on the table. Yet surveys consistently show that roughly 1/3 of workers who have access to employer matching don't contribute enough to get the full match. They're forfeiting thousands of dollars per year in free money. Over decades, with compound interest, this foregone matching can add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost retirement wealth. Why don't people maximize the match? Often because they feel they can't afford to reduce their take-home pay. The money taken out for 401k contributions comes out before they see it, and they need every dollar for current expenses. This is real. Many people live paycheck to paycheck and genuinely can't afford to contribute. But sometimes it's a failure to understand the value of the match and the power of compounding. If someone knew with certainty that contributing $50 more per month would result in $100,000 more in retirement wealth, they might find a way to afford it. But the connection isn't visible or intuitive. The $50 is real and immediate. The $100,000 is abstract and decades away. Let's talk about John Bogle and the index fund revolution, because this innovation democratized compound interest for ordinary investors in ways that weren't previously possible. Before the 1970s, most people who invested in the stock market either picked individual stocks or hired expensive, actively managed mutual funds. Both approaches had problems. Picking individual stocks required knowledge, time, and luck. Most individual investors underperformed the market. Actively managed mutual funds charged high fees, often 1 to 2% of assets annually, and the majority of them underperformed the market indexes over long periods. John Bogle founded Vanguard in 1974 and launched the first index mutual fund available to retail investors in 1976. The idea was radical in its simplicity. Instead of trying to beat the market by picking winning stocks, just buy the entire market. An index fund that owned all 500 stocks in the S&P 500 would by definition match the market's performance, and it could charge very low fees, a fraction of 1%, because it required no research or stock picking. The investment establishment mocked Bogle. They called his index fund un-American for settling for average returns instead of seeking excellence. They insisted that active management was worth the fees. But Bogle understood something about compound interest. Fees compound against you just as investment returns compound for you. If the stock market returns 9% annually and you pay 1.5% in fees, your net return is 7.5%. Over 40 years, this 1.5% annual difference reduces your final wealth by roughly 1/3. A 401k that would have been worth $1 million with low fees is only worth about $670,000 with high fees. The $330,000 difference went to fees and the compound opportunity cost of those fees. Index funds with their low fees, often 0.05% or 0.1%, allowed compound interest to work with minimal drag from costs. Over decades, this made an enormous difference. The index fund revolution transferred trillions of dollars of wealth from the financial industry to ordinary investors by reducing fees and letting compound returns accumulate. Today, index funds and exchange-traded funds based on indexes represent trillions in assets. They're the default investment option in many 401k plans. Millions of people are benefiting from compound stock market returns without paying excessive fees to active managers who usually underperform anyway. Let's explore the concept of dollar cost averaging and how it interacts with compound interest. Dollar cost averaging means investing fixed amounts at regular intervals regardless of market conditions. When you contribute to a 401k through payroll deduction, you're dollar cost averaging automatically. The beauty of dollar cost averaging is that it removes emotion and timing from investing. You buy shares when prices are high and when prices are low. When prices are low, your fixed contribution buys more shares. When prices are high, it buys fewer shares. Over time, you accumulate shares at an average price without trying to time the market. This matters for compound interest because it encourages consistency. The person trying to time the market, buying when they think prices are low, selling when they fear a crash, usually gets it wrong and interrupts the compounding process. The person dollar cost averaging just keeps contributing regardless of market conditions, allowing compound returns to accumulate over the full time period. Historical data shows that time in the market beats timing the market. Someone who invested a lump sum and left it invested for 30 years almost always did better than someone who tried to jump in and out based on market predictions. The compound returns from staying invested overwhelm the gains from occasionally avoiding downturns. Let's talk about the sequence of returns risk, because this is an important but often overlooked aspect of retirement investing. Sequence of returns refers to the order in which investment returns occur over time. During the accumulation phase, when you're building wealth, the sequence doesn't matter much. Whether you earn 10% in year 1 and negative 5% in year 2, or negative 5% in year 1 and 10% in year 2, the end result is roughly the same. You're contributing regularly, buying shares at different prices, and the final accumulation depends on the average return over the entire period. But during the withdrawal phase, retirement sequence matters enormously. If you retire right before a major market crash and have to sell shares to fund living expenses while prices are down, you've locked in losses and reduced your principal permanently. Those shares can't participate in the eventual recovery. This sequence risk can devastate retirement security. This is why target date funds, which automatically shift from stocks to bonds as retirement approaches, became popular. They reduce sequence risk by having less stock exposure when you're near retirement age. The trade-off is lower expected returns. Bonds return less than stocks over long periods, but more stability when you're about to start withdrawals. Understanding sequence risk helps explain the famous 4% rule for retirement withdrawals. The Trinity study, published in the 1990s, analysed historical data to determine safe withdrawal rates. They found that retirees who withdrew 4% of their initial portfolio value annually, adjusted for inflation, had a very high probability of not running out of money over 30 years. Why 4%? Because at this rate the portfolio continues to grow through compound returns even while you're withdrawing funds, as long as you don't hit a severe bear market early in retirement. The investments keep working, dividends keep paying, compound interest keeps operating even as you're living off the portfolio. A portfolio of $750,000 at 4% withdrawal provides $30,000 per year. Combined with Social Security, this can support a modest retirement. The portfolio, if invested appropriately, and if market returns cooperate, might even grow over the retirement period despite the withdrawals, allowing you to leave an inheritance or handle unexpected expenses. Let's talk about Social Security, because it's a form of guaranteed compound return that's often overlooked in discussions of retirement planning. Social Security functions as a pay-as-you-go system. Current workers pay taxes that fund current retirees, but from an individual perspective, it resembles an investment with compound returns. You pay into the system throughout your working life. The benefit you receive in retirement is based on your highest 35 years of earnings, indexed for wage growth. The longer you wait to claim Social Security, up to age 70, the higher your monthly benefit. This delayed claiming bonus is roughly equivalent to earning an 8% annual return on the foregone benefits. If you wait from age 62 to age 70 to claim, your monthly benefit increases by about 75%. For someone in good health with family longevity, Delaying Social Security and letting this guaranteed return compound is one of the best risk-adjusted investments available. It's longevity insurance. The longer you live, the more valuable the higher monthly payment becomes. Social Security is also inflation-adjusted and continues for life. This protection against inflation and longevity risk is extremely valuable and difficult to replicate through private investments. The compound value of a guaranteed inflation-adjusted income stream for life is substantial, though not often calculated explicitly. Let's consider the impact of starting early versus starting late with retirement savings. We touched on this earlier, but it bears deeper exploration because the difference is so dramatic. Suppose two siblings both plan to retire at age 65. The first starts saving at age 25, contributing $3,000 per year for 10 years, then stops contributing at age 35 but leaves the money invested. Total contributions: $30,000. The second sibling waits until age 35 to start, then contributes $3,000 per year for 30 years straight until age 65. Total contributions: $90,000. Assuming 7% annual returns, at age 65, the first sibling has approximately $590,000. The second sibling has approximately $303,000. The first sibling contributed 1/3 as much money and ended up with nearly twice as much wealth. This is the power of early-stage compounding. Those first 10 years from age 25 to 35 had 30 to 40 years to compound. The contributions made from age 55 to 65 only had 0 to 10 years to compound. This math is stark and unforgiving. Starting early matters more than almost any other variable. A 25-year-old contributing $200 per month is building more retirement wealth than a 45-year-old contributing $500 per month. Assuming similar returns, this is why financial advisors obsess over getting young people to start saving. The damage from delayed retirement saving can never be fully repaired. You can't go back and give your money more time to compound. Time is the one ingredient you can't buy or recover. Let's talk about inflation and why it matters for compound returns. We've been discussing nominal returns, the percentage your investments grow each year. But inflation erodes purchasing power, so what matters is real returns. Nominal returns minus inflation. If your investments return 7% annually, but inflation is 3%, your real return is 4%. This is what your purchasing power is actually growing by. Over long periods, this difference compounds significantly. $100,000 growing at 7% for 30 years becomes about $761,000. At 4% real return, it becomes about $324,000. Same initial amount, same time period, but very different outcomes depending on whether we're talking nominal or real returns. This is why stocks, despite their volatility, are important for long-term retirement investing. Stocks have historically provided real returns above inflation, of about 6 to 7% annually. Bonds provide lower real returns, around 2 to 3%. Cash savings accounts often fail to keep up with inflation, providing 0 or negative real returns. Over decades of retirement saving, the difference between 6% real returns and 2% real returns is enormous. At 6%, money doubles in real terms every 12 years. At 2%, it takes 36 years to double in real terms. This is the difference between comfortable retirement and just scraping by. Let's consider asset allocation and how it changes over time. When you're young, with decades until retirement, you can afford to invest heavily in stocks despite their volatility. You'll experience multiple market crashes, but you'll also participate in the longer periods of growth, and time smooths out the volatility. As you approach retirement, the standard advice is to shift toward bonds and more stable investments. The traditional rule of thumb was to hold your age in bonds. A 30-year-old holds 30% bonds, a 60-year-old holds 60% bonds. This reduces volatility as you approach the point where you'll need to start withdrawals. fifth. The tax advantages disproportionately benefit higher earners. Tax deductions for retirement contributions are worth more in higher tax brackets. Someone in the 37% bracket saves 37 cents in taxes for every dollar contributed. Someone in the 12% bracket saves 12 cents. The system provides larger subsidies to those who need them least. Despite these limitations, tax advantage retirement accounts remain the most reliable path to retirement security for most people. The compound growth of investments over decades, sheltered from annual taxes, can transform modest contributions into substantial wealth. It's not perfect, but it works for millions of people. Take a slow breath now. Let these ideas settle gently. Retirement planning involves complex concepts: compound interest, tax advantages, asset allocation, sequence risk. But the underlying principle is simple: save consistently, invest for growth, let time work. The miracle of retirement investing isn't that it creates wealth from nothing. It's that it harnesses compound interest to transform small, achievable contributions into amounts sufficient to support years of non-working life. Previous generations relied on pensions or worked until they died. Modern retirement supported by compound investment returns is a relatively recent development in human history. As you drift towards sleep, picture money flowing into retirement accounts with every paycheck. Picture those funds invested in baskets of stocks and bonds. Picture dividends being reinvested automatically. Picture the accounts growing year after year, crash and recovery, bull market and bear market, but with a general upward trajectory over decades. Picture compound interest working patiently, turning present contributions into future security. This is the eighth wonder at work in ordinary lives. Not creating billionaires or spectacular fortunes, but doing something equally valuable. Providing ordinary people with the possibility of dignified retirement, of financial security in old age, of not being a burden on family or society. The compound returns make this possible where it wouldn't be otherwise. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere right now, millions of retirement accounts are compounding quietly. Stock dividends are being reinvested. Bond interest is accruing. Target date funds are automatically rebalancing. The great machine of retirement saving is humming along, using the power of compound interest to build security for millions of future retirees. Breathe slowly. Rest easy. The wonder works while you sleep. Patient and mathematical, turning today's savings into tomorrow's security, small amounts into sufficient amounts, hope into reality. Let that thought comfort you as you drift into sleep. We've explored how ordinary people can harness compound interest for retirement through 401k accounts and patient investing. But now let's look upward, at the very top of the wealth pyramid, where compound interest operates at scales that seem almost incomprehensible. Because understanding how extreme wealth uses compound interest reveals principles that, while perhaps not replicable at billionaire scale, contain lessons about patience, structure, and the mathematics of wealth that apply at any level. Let's begin with Warren Buffett, whose story we've touched on before. But now let's understand the specific mechanisms by which compound interest created his extraordinary wealth. The results are extraordinary. If you bought one share of Berkshire Hathaway stock in 1965 for $18 and held it until 2023, it would be worth approximately $550,000. That's a 30,000-fold return over 58 years, annual compound return of approximately 21%. But notice the structure. Berkshire doesn't pay dividends, so you can't spend your wealth during this period without selling shares. The wealth is paper wealth. Unrealized gains. This is intentional. Spending would interrupt compounding. The entire system is designed to maximize uninterrupted compound growth. Buffett himself lives modestly. He famously still lives in the house he bought in 1958 for $31,500. He draws a salary of $100,000 per year from Berkshire. His personal spending is minimal relative to his wealth. Why? Because spending would require liquidating investments, which would interrupt compounding and trigger capital gains taxes. His wealth exists primarily as Berkshire Hathaway shares that have compounded for decades and continue compounding. He is not particularly interested in yachts or mansions or private jets, or rather, he's much more interested in watching compound interest create value in his investment portfolio. The compounding itself seems to be what he finds satisfying. Buffett has pledged to give away 99% of his wealth to charity, mostly to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Even in giving it away, he's optimizing for compound interest. He's giving it to a foundation that will invest it and use the returns to fund charitable work indefinitely, allowing even his philanthropic capital to compound across generations. Let's turn now to Jeff Bezos and understand how his wealth represents a different form of compound interest, the compounding value of equity in a growing company. Bezos founded Amazon in 1994 as an online bookstore operating from his garage. He took the company public in 1997 at a split-adjusted price of about $1.50 per share. Bezos retained a large ownership stake, initially around 40% of the company, gradually diluted to around 10% as Amazon issued more shares for acquisitions and employee compensation. Amazon famously didn't make consistent profits for its first many years. It reinvested all revenue back into growth, building warehouses, expanding product categories, developing technology infrastructure. Wall Street analysts questioned this strategy. When would Amazon actually make money for shareholders? But Bezos understood compound growth in a different context: customer base and infrastructure. Every dollar invested in customer acquisition, in infrastructure, in technology, created capacity for future growth. The value wasn't in current profits, but in future cash flows that would eventually result from the platform being built. Amazon's revenue grew exponentially, from hundreds of millions in the late 1990s to billions in the 2000s to hundreds of billions by the 2020s. The stock price followed, with plenty of volatility but a clear upward trajectory over decades. Bezos's wealth is almost entirely Amazon stock. As the stock price compounded, so did his net worth. At Amazon's peak valuation, Bezos was worth over $200 billion, almost all of it unrealized gains in Amazon stock. He hadn't sold most of his shares. The wealth existed as ownership in a company whose value had compounded from nothing to over $1 trillion in market capitalization. Family offices allow wealth to compound across generations by minimizing taxes and expenses. They employ top investment professionals. They access investment opportunities unavailable to ordinary investors: private equity, hedge funds, direct investments in startups, real estate syndications. They structure holdings to defer or minimize taxes. The Rockefeller family wealth has compounded across more than a century through careful management by their family office. John D. Rockefeller was history's wealthiest person, worth perhaps $400 billion in today's dollars at his peak. His descendants, now numbering in the hundreds, have maintained substantial wealth across multiple generations through careful investment and tax planning. This multi-generational compounding was enabled by structures like dynasty trusts, which hold assets for multiple generations while minimizing estate taxes. The trust owns the assets, not any individual family member. The trust compounds indefinitely. Distributions are made to family members as needed, but the principal continues growing. Dynasty trusts can last for centuries in some jurisdictions. Imagine a trust funded in 1900 with $1 million, compounding at 7% annually for over a century. By 2023, it would be worth over $2 billion, despite distributions along the way. The trust structure protected the compounding process across multiple generations. These structures aren't available to ordinary people, but the principle applies at any level. Minimize interruptions to compounding. Taxes, fees, unnecessary withdrawals, These interrupt compounding. The ultra-wealthy use sophisticated structures to minimize these interruptions. Ordinary people can apply the same principle within their constraints. Keep costs low, minimize tax drag through tax-advantaged accounts, avoid unnecessary withdrawals. Let's talk about qualified small business stock. Section 1202 stock in the tax code, which represents another tool for ultra-wealthy wealth creation through compounding. This provision allows startup founders and early employees to exclude from taxation up to $10 million in capital gains on qualified small business stock held for at least 5 years, or 10 times the basis if that's greater. This means startup founders can build companies, take them public or sell them, and realize enormous gains largely tax-free. Those gains can then be reinvested in other investments to compound further. This tax advantage is unavailable to ordinary workers earning wages or investors buying public stocks. It's specifically for founders and early employees of qualifying startups. Peter Thiel famously used this provision, along with a Roth IRA structure, to build a retirement account worth over $5 billion, according to some estimates. The mechanisms are complex, but essentially, invest in startup stock through a Roth IRA, qualify for Section 1202 treatment, have the companies grow enormously in value, all compounding tax-free within the Roth structure because Roth IRA gains are never taxed if withdrawn after age 59 and a half. A billionaire whose net worth increases by $1 billion in a year due to stock appreciation pays 0 taxes on that gain unless they sell the stock. The wealth compounds tax-free. Meanwhile, a worker whose salary increases by $10,000 pays taxes immediately on that income. The ultra-wealthy can even access their wealth without selling assets through strategies like borrowing against their holdings. If you own $1 billion in stock, banks will lend you hundreds of millions at low interest rates using the stock as collateral. You get cash to spend, you pay low interest on the loan, perhaps 2 or 3%, while your stock continues compounding at perhaps 8 to 10%. The arbitrage creates wealth. When you die, your heirs receive your assets with a step up in basis, meaning the cost basis for tax purposes resets to the market value at your death. All the unrealized gains that compounded during your lifetime are never taxed. Your heirs can sell immediately and pay no capital gains tax. This is how dynastic wealth compounds across generations, largely tax-free. Each generation's wealth compounds during their lifetime without tax on unrealized gains. At death, the basis steps up, eliminating the tax liability. The next generation inherits and continues the compounding process. Ordinary people can't easily replicate this because they need their income for living expenses. They can't leave wealth unrealized for decades because they need to realize it to eat, pay rent, buy necessities. But understanding the mechanism reveals something important. The ability to defer realization, to let wealth compound without tax friction, is enormously valuable. Let's consider endowments, how universities and foundations use compound interest to fund operations indefinitely. The Yale Endowment, managed for decades by David Swensen, is a famous example. Yale's endowment is roughly $40 billion. It's invested in a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, private equity, real estate, and alternative investments. The target is to distribute approximately 5% per year to support university operations while allowing the principal to grow enough to keep up with inflation. At 5% distribution, Yale's endowment provides about $2 billion per year to support teaching, research, and operations. This is possible because the endowment has historically returned more than 7% annually, enough to distribute 5% and grow the principal at roughly 2% above inflation. This is perpetual compound interest. The endowment compounds forever, supporting the institution across centuries. Yale has been around since 1701. Its endowment, carefully managed and compounded, supports its operations indefinitely, assuming reasonable investment returns continue. David Swensen pioneered the _8_ of endowment investing. Diversify broadly, including illiquid alternative investments, accept higher risk for higher returns, maintain discipline through market cycles. Yale's endowment has compounded at roughly 11% annually over several decades, far outperforming traditional stock bond portfolios. This success allowed Yale to distribute more to operations while growing the endowment principal faster than inflation. The compound return supported both current operations and future growth. Other endowments copied the Yale model with varying success. Harvard's endowment, the world's largest at over $50 billion, follows similar principles. Stanford's, Princeton's, MIT's all use compound investment returns to support educational missions across generations. The principle scales down too. A small private foundation with $10 million, distributing 5% annually and earning 7%, can distribute $500,000 per year to charitable causes forever, while the principal grows at 2% above inflation. Compound interest enables perpetual philanthropy. The government pays interest on these bonds every year. This interest payment is part of the federal budget. In recent years, interest payments on the national debt have approached $1 trillion annually. Think about that. $1 trillion per year just paying interest on accumulated debt. That's money that could fund education, infrastructure, healthcare, or tax cuts, instead going to bondholders as interest payments. And here's where compound interest becomes relevant. If the government runs deficits, if it spends more than it collects, it must borrow not only to fund the deficit, but also to pay interest on existing debt. This creates a feedback loop. Debt generates interest. Interest increases spending. Increased spending creates larger deficits. Larger deficits require more borrowing. More borrowing creates more debt. More debt generates more interest. This cycle compounds. At current interest rates and deficit levels, the national debt is growing faster than the economy. Eventually, this becomes unsustainable. But quote 9 can be a long time when you're a sovereign nation that can print its own currency and has the world's largest economy. Let's talk about government bonds and why people buy them, because this reveals something important about how compound interest operates in national finance. But the United States didn't have $15 million sitting around. The government issued bonds to finance the purchase, borrowing the money and promising to pay it back with interest over time. Those bonds and their interest compounded in the national debt, though they were eventually paid off. The question is, was this worth it? The government paid perhaps $20 million total, including interest over the years it took to pay off the bonds. In return, it acquired land now worth trillions of dollars, containing vast agricultural resources, minerals, oil, and economic potential. This is compound interest working in favor of debt. The value of what was purchased compounded faster than the cost of the debt. Smart borrowing for productive investments can work at national scale just as it can work personally. Let's talk about war bonds and how compound interest funded World War II. The United States entered World War II in December 1941. Financing the war required unprecedented government spending. The federal budget increased nearly tenfold between 1941 and 1945. The government funded this through taxes, but also through war bonds sold to American citizens. Propaganda campaigns encouraged people to buy war bonds as a patriotic duty. Movie stars promoted them. Posters plastered cities. Workers bought bonds through payroll deduction programs. Let's consider a dramatic historical example. Paul Volcker's interest rate shock in the early 1980s. Volcker became Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979, facing inflation running above 13% annually. Prices were rising so fast that savings were being destroyed, contracts were becoming meaningless, economic planning was impossible. Volcker raised interest rates drastically. The federal funds rate reached 20% in June 1981. 20%. Mortgages were charging 16 to 18%. Car loans were even higher. The economic pain was severe. Borrowing collapsed. Unemployment soared. A recession hit. But the high interest rates worked. Inflation fell from 13% to under 4% within a few years. The compound destruction of inflation was halted. But the cost was high. Years of economic suffering, millions unemployed, businesses bankrupted. The medicine worked, but it was bitter. This illustrates the power of compound interest at macroeconomic scale. Small changes in interest rates, compounded across millions of loans and trillions of dollars, can slow or accelerate an entire economy. The Federal Reserve essentially controls the rate at which economic activity compounds. Let's talk about Japan's lost decades and what happens when interest rates approach zero and stay there. In 1989, Japan's economy was booming. Stock prices and real estate prices had risen dramatically. The Nikkei stock index reached nearly 39,000. Then the bubble burst. Stock prices fell. Real estate prices collapsed. Banks, which had lent heavily against real estate collateral, faced enormous losses. The economy stagnated. Japan entered a period of very low growth that lasted for decades, continuing into the 21st century. The Bank of Japan, Japan's central bank, lowered interest rates trying to stimulate growth. By 1999, rates were at zero. Zero. You could borrow money for free, but it didn't work. Economic growth remained weak. Deflation, falling prices became a problem. Why didn't zero interest rates stimulate borrowing and growth? Partly because even at 0% interest, people and businesses wouldn't borrow if they didn't see profitable opportunities. And with deflation, the real interest rate, the nominal rate minus inflation, was actually positive even when nominal rates were zero. Japan's experience shows the limits of interest rate policy. Compound interest is powerful, but it's not omnipotent. You can make borrowing free, but you can't force people to borrow or invest if they don't see attractive opportunities. Let's talk about quantitative easing, which is what central banks do when lowering interest rates to zero isn't enough. Quantitative easing means the central bank creates money to buy government bonds and other assets. This injects money into the financial system, pushes up asset prices, and lowers long-term interest rates. The Federal Reserve engaged in massive quantitative easing after the 2008 financial crisis and again during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Fed's balance sheet, the total assets it holds, expanded from under $1 trillion before 2008 to nearly $9 trillion at its peak. Let's talk about Social Security from a different angle, as a massive compound promise from the government. Social Security is structured as pay-as-you-go, but the trust fund that holds excess contributions is invested in treasury bonds, earning interest. Let's talk about the debt-to-GDP ratio and why it matters more than absolute debt levels. The United States national debt is over $33 trillion. This sounds catastrophic, but the economy, GDP, is roughly $27 trillion per year. So the debt-to-GDP ratio is about 123%. Is this sustainable? It depends. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is over 250%, yet Japan continues to function, to borrow at low rates, to pay its obligations. Greece's ratio reached about 180% and faced a crisis. Why the difference? Sustainability depends on several factors. Can the country print its own currency? The United States and Japan can. Greece uses the euro and can't. What interest rate does the country pay? Lower rates make higher debt more sustainable. Is the economy growing? Growth makes debt more manageable. Do creditors trust the government to repay? Trust keeps rates low. The compound mathematics works differently when these factors change. At 2% interest and 3% economic growth, debt becomes easier to manage over time. Growth compounds faster than interest. At 5% interest and 1% growth, debt becomes increasingly burdensome. Interest compounds faster than the economy grows. Right now, the United States pays relatively low interest rates, and the economy grows, so the debt is manageable despite its size. But if rates rise significantly or growth slows, the compound dynamics could shift unfavourably. This is the risk compound interest creates for governments. Let's consider hyperinflation as compound interest gone catastrophically wrong. Weimar Germany in the early 1920s experienced hyperinflation, where prices doubled every few days. Zimbabwe in the 2000s faced similar chaos, Venezuela more recently. The mathematics is the same we've been discussing throughout. Money grows exponentially over time at a given rate, but at governmental scale, these exponential curves shape the possibilities and constraints for hundreds of millions of people. Understanding this doesn't require expertise in economics. It just requires recognizing that the same compound interest that affects your retirement account also affects national budgets, that the same exponential mathematics applies at individual and national scales, that time multiplies everything, debts and assets, inflation and growth, good decisions and bad ones. Governments, like individuals, face the fundamental challenge of compound interest. Use it wisely and it builds prosperity over generations. Use it poorly and it creates compounding problems that burden the future. The difference is that when governments make mistakes, entire populations bear the consequences. This is the essence of corporate growth. Take profits, reinvest them in the business, generate more profits, reinvest those, creating a cycle of compound expansion. Revenue grows, profits grow, the value of the business grows, shareholders' wealth compounds along with the business. Amazon provides perhaps the clearest example of this principle, pushed to its extreme. Jeff Bezos founded Amazon in 1994 as an online bookstore. The company went public in 1997 at a split-adjusted price of roughly $1.50 per share. For over 20 years, Amazon reinvested essentially all its profits back into growth. When analysts and investors asked when Amazon would start returning cash to shareholders through dividends or share buybacks, Bezos's answer was consistent. Never, as long as there are profitable growth opportunities. Every dollar of profit would be reinvested in warehouses, technology, new product categories, international expansion. Companies with low ROIC should return cash to shareholders rather than reinvesting, but many don't. Management likes growing empires, even if that growth doesn't create value. This is why activist investors sometimes push companies to return cash through dividends or buybacks rather than pursuing low-return growth. The compound mathematics is clear. High ROIC justifies reinvestment and creates compound value growth. Low ROIC suggests returning cash and letting shareholders compound it elsewhere. But egos, incentives, and institutional inertia often override this logic. Let's talk about Apple's transformation from near bankruptcy to the world's most valuable company, because it demonstrates both the power of compound growth and the evolution of corporate capital allocation strategies. In the late 1990s, Apple was struggling, market share was low, profits were minimal, the company was months from bankruptcy when Steve Jobs returned as CEO in 1997. Jobs cut products, focused on design and user experience, and launched a series of successful products: the iMac, iPod, iPhone, iPad. Apple's revenue and profits compounded dramatically, from billions in revenue in the early 2000s to hundreds of billions by the 2020s. The stock price compounded along with the business. One share purchased in 2002 for about $1, split adjusted, was worth over $170 by 2023, a 170-fold return over roughly 20 years. But Apple's capital allocation evolved. Unlike Amazon, which reinvested everything, Apple accumulated enormous cash reserves, at one point over $200 billion. The company couldn't reinvest all its profits at high returns because there weren't enough sufficiently profitable opportunities, so Apple began returning cash to shareholders through dividends and share buybacks. Since 2012, Apple has returned hundreds of billions to shareholders. This wasn't admission of failure. It was recognition that at Apple's scale, reinvesting all profits wasn't optimal. Better to return cash and let shareholders compound it through their diversified portfolios. The share buybacks themselves create compound effects. When Apple buys back shares, reducing shares outstanding. Each remaining share represents a larger portion of the company. Earnings per share increase even if total earnings are flat. Stock price tends to rise. Shareholders benefit from this compound concentration of ownership. Let's talk about dividend reinvestment and how it creates compound returns for shareholders. Some companies pay consistent dividends, regular cash distributions to shareholders. Traditional dividend investors might spend this income. But reinvesting dividends creates powerful compounding. Suppose you own 100 shares of a stock trading at $50 per share for a total value of $5,000. The company pays a 2% annual dividend, $1 per share, $100 total for your 100 shares. You reinvest this dividend, buying 2 more shares at $50 each. Next year you own 102 shares. At the same 2% dividend, you receive $1.02 per share, $104.04 total. You reinvest, buying roughly 2.08 shares. The process compounds. Over decades, the dividends buy more and more shares, which generate more dividends, which buy more shares. Historical data shows that dividends reinvested account for a huge portion of total stock market returns. From 1930 to 2020, roughly 40% of the S&P 500's total return came from reinvested dividends. The price appreciation provided the other 60%, but that 40% from dividends compounding is essential. Companies that have consistently raised dividends for decades, dividend aristocrats, companies with 25+ years of dividend increases, have provided spectacular compound returns for patient shareholders who reinvested. Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, these stalwarts compounded shareholder wealth through steady dividend growth and reinvestment. Let's talk about stock splits and how they relate to compound growth. When a stock price becomes very high, say several $100s per share, companies sometimes split the stock to make shares more affordable to smaller investors. Facebook, Google, Amazon, in its early days, Airbnb, Uber, these companies compounded at extraordinary rates in their growth phases. Early investors who bought in when valuations were tiny and held through explosive growth made thousand-fold returns. These compound home runs fund the entire venture capital industry. Let's talk about network effects as a form of compound growth. Network effects occur when a product or service becomes more valuable as more people use it. Facebook is more valuable because your friends are on it. The telephone is more valuable because other people have telephones. Credit cards are more valuable because more merchants accept them. The business implications were profound. Companies that rode Moore's law, Intel, Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia, benefited from continuously improving products at stable or declining prices. Companies that fought it or ignored it were disrupted. The compound improvement in computing power destroyed entire industries and created new ones. Moore's law appears to be slowing now as physical limits of silicon are approached. But the principle it demonstrated, that technological progress can compound predictably over decades, has been applied to other domains. Solar panel efficiency, battery energy density, DNA sequencing cost, all follow similar compound improvement curves in their respective fields. Let's talk about corporate debt and how companies use leverage to amplify compound returns. Leverage means using borrowed money to invest. If you can borrow at 5% and invest at 10%, the 5% spread compounds into significant value, and the leverage amplifies your returns on equity. Suppose a company invests $1 million of equity in a project that returns 10% annually. After 1 year, the company has $100,000 in profit. Over 10 years, compounding at 10%, the initial million becomes about $2.59 million. Now suppose the company borrows an additional $4 million at 5% interest to invest in the same project. Total investment is $5 million. 1 million equity, 4 million debt. The project returns 10% on $5 million, $500,000. The company pays 5% interest on $4 million in debt, $200,000. Net profit, $300,000 on $1 million of equity, a 30% return on equity. Positive unit economics means each unit is profitable. Scale the business, increase units, and profits compound. Negative unit economics means each unit loses money. Scale the business and losses compound. This seems obvious, but many startups have scaled businesses with negative unit economics, hoping to eventually achieve positive economics through scale. The bet is that fixed costs can be spread over more units, driving per unit cost down, while network effects or brand strength allow per unit revenue to rise. If this works, unit economics improve with scale, and the business transitions from compounding losses to compounding profits. Uber and Lyft debated whether ride-sharing has positive unit economics at scale. Netflix debated the same about streaming. Amazon debated it about e-commerce. In each case, the question was, will scale create positive compound dynamics, or will it just compound losses faster? The answer determines whether growth creates or destroys value. Growth companies that achieve positive unit economics at scale compound into valuable businesses. Those that don't eventually collapse under compounding losses. Let's talk about index funds as baskets of compounding businesses. When you invest in an S&P 500 index fund, you're buying small pieces of 500 large American companies. These companies collectively compound their earnings over time through reinvestment and growth. The index itself compounds at roughly the weighted average of its components' growth rates. Historically, this has been about 9 to 10% annually, including dividends. Some companies in the index outperform, some underperform, some go bankrupt and are replaced. But the basket as a whole compounds. This is profound. You can own a piece of the compound growth of American corporate enterprise without picking individual winners. The index automatically adjusts, dropping failures and adding successful new companies. Your investment compounds along with the overall economy's productive capacity. Vanguard's S&P 500 index fund, created by John Bogle, has turned tens of thousands of dollars invested decades ago into millions for patient holders who reinvested dividends and held through market cycles. The compound returns weren't from stock-picking genius, but from harnessing the collective compound growth of American business. Let's talk about creative destruction, and how compound growth in some businesses means compound decline in others. When Amazon compounds its retail revenue, traditional retailers like Sears and JCPenney see declining revenues. When Netflix compounds its subscriber base, cable TV companies see cord-cutting accelerate. Compound growth in one sector often means compound decline in another. Joseph Schumpeter called this creative destruction, capitalism's tendency to continuously revolutionize economic structures from within, destroying old industries while creating new ones. The compound mathematics applies to destruction just as to creation. Market share loss compounds into irrelevance. Revenue decline compounds into bankruptcy. Kodak dominated film photography. Digital photography emerged and compounded its market share. Film declined, slowly at first, then catastrophically. Kodak filed for bankruptcy. The company that invented the digital camera was destroyed by the compound growth of the technology it created. This is the dark side of corporate compound growth. For every Amazon compounding into dominance, there are retailers compounding into extinction. For every Tesla growing exponentially, there are traditional automakers losing market share. The compound mathematics creates winners and losers with increasing divergence over time. Let's talk about how corporations structure themselves to maximize compound growth. Holding companies like Berkshire Hathaway, conglomerates like 3M, platform companies like Alphabet, each represents a different structural approach to compounding corporate value. Berkshire's structure allows Buffett to compound capital by moving it between wholly owned businesses and stock investments without tax friction. Profits from insurance companies are invested in stocks. Gains from stocks fund acquisitions of businesses. Earnings from businesses are reinvested or used to buy more stocks. Capital compounds throughout the structure with minimal tax leakage. Alphabet's structure separates Google's profitable core businesses from speculative _quote_12_ like the wonder works in corporate form just as it works personally. The mathematics doesn't change. Money invested wisely compounds over time, whether invested by individuals in stocks or by corporations in growth opportunities. The scale differs, but the principle remains constant. Time and wise investment transforms small into large, present into future, seed capital into mature enterprise. Let that thought comfort you as you drift towards sleep. The compound growth of businesses creates the products you use, the jobs available in the economy, the returns in your retirement account. It's not abstract. It's the lived reality of modern capitalism, powered by the eighth wonder, turning today's investments into tomorrow's prosperity. Let's talk about artificial intelligence and how it demonstrates compound learning curves. When you train an AI model, it improves through exposure to data. More data means better performance. Better performance means the AI can tackle harder problems, generate more valuable insights, attract more users and funding, which generates more data, which improves performance further. This is a compound learning loop. GPT models, the AI systems underlying modern language models, have grown exponentially in capability with each generation. GPT-2 had 1.5 billion parameters. GPT-3 had 175 billion parameters. GPT-4's architecture is more complex still. Each generation trained on more data for longer, with more computational resources. The improvement isn't linear. The jump from GPT-2 to GPT-3 wasn't just incremental, it was qualitative. Capabilities emerged that weren't present before. The compound scaling of model size, data, and training compute created something genuinely new, and this compounds forward. Better AI systems can help design the next generation of AI systems. They can optimize code, suggest architectures, even generate training data. The tools that create AI are themselves becoming AI enhanced, creating a feedback loop of compound capability improvement. Where does this lead? No one knows with certainty, but the compound trajectory is clear. AI capabilities are improving exponentially, and the rate of improvement shows no signs of slowing. What takes AI systems years to learn today might take months in a few years, days eventually. Perhaps hours. The compound acceleration of machine learning is one of the most significant technological trends of our era. Let's talk about cryptocurrency and decentralized finance, DeFi, because these represent compound interest mechanisms rebuilt from first principles using blockchain technology. Traditional finance uses compound interest through banks and institutions. DeFi attempts to recreate these mechanisms in decentralized automated form. Staking is one example. In proof-of-stake blockchain systems, you can stake your cryptocurrency, lock it up to help secure the network, and receive rewards, typically paid in more of the same cryptocurrency. These rewards compound if you stake them as well. Annual percentage yields on staking can range from 3 to 15% depending on the network and conditions. This is compound interest, but implemented through cryptographic protocols rather than banks. The mathematics is the same. Your holdings grow exponentially over time, but the mechanism is code running on a distributed network. Liquidity pools in DeFi take this further. You can deposit cryptocurrency into a pool that facilitates trading. Traders pay fees which are distributed to liquidity providers. These fees can be substantial, sometimes 20, 50, even over 100% annually during high activity periods. But there's enormous risk. Smart contract bugs can drain pools. Cryptocurrency prices are wildly volatile. Your 100% yield doesn't help if the underlying asset loses 70% of its value. Impermanent loss can occur when prices in a liquidity pool diverge from external markets. The compound returns can be spectacular or devastating, depending on countless variables. Yield farming takes compound DeFi returns to an extreme. Users move cryptocurrency between different protocols to maximize yield, staking in one place, lending in another, providing liquidity in a third, all while continuously claiming rewards and restaking them. Some yield farmers achieve returns of several 100% annually, for a while. But these extreme returns are temporary and risky. They often come from protocol incentives, newly launched DeFi systems distributing tokens to attract users. Once incentives end or users move to the next opportunity, yields collapse. Many yield farmers have lost everything in protocol hacks, price crashes, or sudden liquidity crunches. And so we've travelled together through time and mathematics, through ancient clay tablets and Renaissance counting houses, through the stories of patient savers and patient civilizations, through the bright promise and dark shadow of money growing on itself across years and centuries. We've seen how the eighth wonder, whether Einstein named it or someone else did, whether the words were ever spoken or simply felt, operates with perfect neutrality, multiplying wealth and debt alike, creating fortunes and traps, shaping individual retirements and national destinies according to its exponential logic. You understand now that compound interest is simply time-given form through mathematics. It's the universe's patient way of transforming small into large, present into future, seed into harvest. It works while you sleep, while you wake, while you live your life unaware. It asks only three things: something to grow, time to work, and the patience not to interrupt. Wherever you are right now, in whatever circumstance, you're part of this ancient story. Every choice about saving or spending, every decision about patience or urgency, every moment you let something grow undisturbed, you're participating in the same mathematics that built pyramids of wealth and knowledge across millennia. Let that settle now. Let it all go. The numbers fade. The stories blur. What remains is simple. Time multiplies. Patience rewards. Small beginnings matter. The wonder works. It's working now, even as your breath slows, as your thoughts drift, as sleep comes gently like compound interest itself. Gradually, then all at once. Rest now. The eighth wonder keeps watch. Mathematics never sleeps, but you can, you should, let go completely. The wonder will still be here tomorrow, patient as always, waiting to work its quiet magic while you dream. Sleep well.